Hello, everybody. It's Sunday night, or maybe it's Sunday morning, depending on where you're at, and we are ready for another episode of Read and Talk about Gemology. We are going to be talking today with Edward Boehm about portable instruments and tips about gemology in the field. If you have been with us before, then you probably already know that this webinar theme is all about reading. So every month, we talk to a different author about a different topic, maybe something that they've written or something that they're working on or maybe a long-term project. And we like to get behind the scenes, the story behind the story and really talk, as you can see, we've talked to really some of the well, in my opinion, some of the bigger names in the world of gemology, at least the ones that are still with us. And we're going to continue that tradition today with Edward. And yeah, I'm excited. I know some of you guys in the chat are expressing your excitement. Every webinar that we've done so far has been really exciting to me, and some of these people that we've spoken to have been, really some of the people that are filling my bookshelf, and I'm sure are the ones filling your bookshelf as well. So yeah, let's get into it. Vincent, if you're ready, um, we can roll.
Yeah, hello, Justin. Hello,
Welcome.
everybody.
We're back
Yeah,
for another month. This is month 9, I think. Yes, 9.
yeah. Well, this is month 9, but this is a little bit more actually than 1 year that we started this story with the webinars, and a little bit more than 1 year, yes, because we
Yeah.
started in early May last year when
Yeah, I know now.
COVID
I think last time we were saying soon we'll be getting Facebook memories that 1 year ago we did this webinar, and that already started happening a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago now. Um, so yeah, 1 year.
yeah,
Uh, we meant
not
to
the first.
have we should
Mhm.
have planned like a sort of a celebratory moment. We could have had a glass of champagne across the internet right now. But okay, we can do
Yeah.
that another time. We'll do that on the 2 year
I'm
anniversary.
not, I'm not in a super celebrating mood about because, as
Yeah,
you
I
know,
know.
I lost several good friends, so including Jean-Claude Michelou, who was our guest 4 months ago, and he passed away from COVID. And that's the third of my close friend
Yeah,
who is not anymore with us now. So please, everybody around, just be careful. And even if we are vaccinated, or if you get vaccinated, don't forget that vaccine doesn't stop you from getting COVID and passing COVID to people around you.
good
So
point. Good
yeah.
point. So we're going to be talking to Edward Boehm today. Tell us a little bit about how he came to be our guest. At least, how do you know Edward, or what does Edward mean to you as far
Yeah,
as the series goes?
Edward means to me something very interesting because just after my gemology studies in Myanmar and then in Thailand, I studied in Thailand at GIA. I graduated in December 2001, and then because I used to go regularly at GIA in Thailand, they were getting all the issue of gem and gemology, and then in 2002, I went to GA in Thailand, and then I found the new issue of Gem and Gemmology, and in that issue, there was an article about portable instruments for the field. And at this time, I was just getting my first job in the industry as a gemstone buyer for Henry Ho in Myanmar. So I was returning there. I had already the book by Antoinette Matlins, but what was great to me is that basically Edward was able to condensate the book in one article, and there were a few things in that article that were slightly different from what Antoinette said. So it was great. And at the same time, I was also teaching gemology to people at the AGS. I was part-time buyer in Burma and part-time gemology teacher in Bangkok, and I was motivating my students to read about, for example, the book by Antoinette Matlins. But many of them say, the book is too big. It's kind of too much. But I say, okay, in that case, just get a Gem on Gemmology and read the field gemology article by Edward. And the funny thing is, for many years, I was nearly sure that the title of the article by Edward was Field Gemology Instrument. And I was nearly sure that Edward coined the word field gemology. So I was all the time referring to the field gemology article by Edward. And this is the way the word field gemology came. And I started to speak about field gemology to my student at the LGS because I was thinking that it was in Edward article, but actually it was not. So sometimes, the brain is doing some funny thing. So this is the reason why I learned about Edward. And then I was super happy to meet him for the first time in 2005 when I became an ICA member and I went to the ICA Congress. And I was surprised to see that Edward was MC. He was a guy, introducing all the speakers, and that was impressive. So I was able to go to see him and to introduce myself and meet, and we became friends. Then I spent more time with him when I moved to the Googling Gem Lab in 2007, because Edward was traveling regularly from the US to Switzerland, and every time he was going to Lucerne, we were meeting and having a coffee or a lunch. So we became good friends at this time.
Yeah.
And he's a fascinating guy because, as I say, I learned about instrument, to go to the field because I read the book from Antoinette Matlins. I read Ruby and Sapphire, and there was also this article. But Edward went to the field before me. And at this time, there was not this type of article. He went to the field. Ruby and Sapphire I don't think it was even written. So he went to the field, like really one of the first person who went there and started to write article about his discoveries. And I think that he was greatly influenced by his grandfather. Yeah. So, yeah, that's...
and so we're going to get to hear...
He was a kind of model. He was a kind of model.
So I think we're going to get to hear a little bit about all that, about the Googling lab, about the field gemology, about good stories of the grandfather. I know for me, when I first met you, Vincent, and you had given me the opportunity to come to Cambodia with you, one of the things that you sort of told me to do before we left was you have to read this article among other articles that you gave me. But I remember that was kind of part of the kit of like, here's how to get ready for the trip. You need to read this article. So that's when I first knew. And yeah, it was a great article. And as you said, easy to read. It's not very long. It's something you can just sit there and read in about 30 minutes or maybe even less. And yeah.
I think this is the kind of article that every person who want to buy stone, not just in the field, but also you want to travel to a gem market and things like that. This is something that is worth reading, and then it shows you really some of the interest about learning about gemology, whatever you want to do. And one thing that is very interesting is that Edward is actually a gem merchant. So this is not basically an article that was just written for gemologists, to show off with other gemologists. No. He's really using this gemological instrument in his business, which is buying stone and trading stones.
Yeah. So it's really practical for everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So shall we invite him in and he can tell us a little bit about how this all happened?
Yep.
Okay, Edward, if you're ready, come on in, unmute and start your video. Yes. And welcome.
Hey guys. Hello, everybody around the world. Thank you for tuning in.
Thanks for being here.
I look like an old guy now compared to you. You look all the time young.
Yeah.
That's
Vincent, it's you let that beard grow out and you look much more distinguished as time goes by. So it's not old, it's distinguished.
He's a wise man now.
Listen to me because without the beard, nobody will listen to me. That was
that's an interesting story. when I was much younger and I was working at the trade shows with Pala International, I didn't have my goatee that I have now, and I grew my beard out when I went to Burma on that trip with my grandfather, and I came back, and it was almost uh, shocking the difference in respect that I got because I now had this beard and looked older. So I kept the beard for a while and then trimmed it down to the goatee, and I've had it ever since.
Not a
Yeah.
bad way.
When you're young, you don't get the respect that you hope you can get. So you have to do something. You have to start writing articles too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
facial hair, writing articles. That really worked for me too.
Yeah.
yeah. When you go to the field and you meet an official, people, and you go to ask an authorization, and you say, well, I'm a kind of professor, I'm a gemology teacher, and things like that. If you look like a 25 years old guy, the guy look at you and say, what are you telling me? You don't
That's
look you don't look very credible. So I found out that every time I was growing my beard and looking like that, yeah, I was traveling with somebody younger, so he's my assistant, and suddenly everything was okay. People were listening to me, officials and things like that. It was much more easy to get the authorization to visit the mining area with a beard than without a beard. So I started to use a beard when I was going to the field, and also I'm allergic to sun, so then I get burned with my skin and things like that. So the beard is also a good protection for the sun. So
and you fit in culturally when you were traveling through Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's kind of a necessity to wear a beard, man.
I blend. I can
Yeah.
blend.
Yeah.
I have to remove the glasses, but then I can blend.
Yeah.
Okay, well, to kick it off, somebody already asked, is the article available online somewhere? I'm putting that into the chat for anybody who hasn't already read it. It's
Yeah.
there. You can find it, get it before the webinar ends. Okay, so
this
Edward,
If
was
you can also go indirectly through my website on publications if you wanted to look at other publications that I've written to raresource.com, and then there in that section it'll link you then directly to GIAs
okay,
or whatever other
yeah,
journal of gemology, what have you.
rare source.
and this is one of the great things with GIA, and for kind of many years now, they have put number one, there is all the old Gemmology that are online, so there is a huge amount of knowledge that is available online for everybody who want to go to read them. And then using Google, there have also a lot of articles that are excellent, that are directly on the website. And just putting on Google the name Edward Boehm field instrument, and you will get to that article.
Yep.
So very easy.
That's how I just found it.
So yeah, when I talked to you in Cambodia after the trip in Cambodia,
yeah,
but that was good because actually you went to see that many of the young people I tell about, you should go on this website and get this article. Many of them actually never go.
that's
Then
probably
when I found out, they feel a bit like stupid, but
yeah. Well, maybe that's why I'm still here, and they went home. They didn't read the book, so they had to go home. Okay, so Edward, we gave you a little introduction, but maybe you could tell us better who you are and how you basically got to the point where you were ready to write that kind of an article. Well, first of all, let me ask, because I didn't just look, what year was that the article came out?
It came out in the spring 2002 issue of Gems Gemology, which is this one right here.
Wow, so this
And
is like a 20-year anniversary of this article.
Yeah, it is actually. It's kind of it's perfect timing.
Yeah.
This was an issue that was published by Alice Keller, and Gems and Gemology. She was the editor in chief at the time, and it was in honor of Mr. Liddicoat. And so they sent out requests for articles that would honor him. And because I had always wanted to do something like that, and Mr. Liddicoat had written so many articles on gem instruments and gem testing and so forth, I thought that would be a fun kind of segue into what was really happening, I thought, at the time in gemology, with people, wanting to go out more and more into the field and try and purchase gems on site. And at that time, it was still much easier to travel to places. There was starting to become, some overlap. And the reason that I actually went on my very first field trip was to collect samples for the Gubelin lab in the early 90s in Africa. And I had some good connections there. So that's why we chose Africa. There were some issues with some rubies coming out of different parts of Africa and Morogoro, some new deposits. There was also, just lots of gem materials that were fascinating. And so that's kind of how I had started in the early 90s traveling. But by that time, when I wrote this article, I had numerous trips under my belt and really started to understand the value of these portable instruments, not only in the field, like where Vincent and I go often, but also at trade shows. And, that's a lot of your focus of your webinar with Antoinette was that she was educating people at trade shows or at, gem offices and so forth to be able to use these instruments there. But they have, even more an additional application in the field, because you're really having to be forensic, because you can't, you're not dealing with a known dealer that you've always worked with, that you have maybe a relationship with already. And many of the miners, often that are showing you synthetics or, imitations or so forth, it's difficult to blame them. One, some of them have been taken themselves and they have no idea what they're passing on. They're just trying to make another buck. And two, maybe they, can spend a week fashioning an imitation and, make $100 on that imitation, which for them would represent a month's salary, or they can go to the mine and toil in the mine and not find anything. So, it's hard to blame them. But it's important, if you're going to be spending more than $100 or thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, that you know what you're buying. So that's kind of where I decided that I thought it was valuable to write this article for the dealers and field gemologists like Vincent that were out there wanting to learn more about what they could do on the ground.
There was not yet field gemology, because I think that there were many gem merchants, were going, but actually I think you were one of the first field gemologists with your grandfather, because for me, the definition of a field gemologist is somebody who go to the field to buy sample, to study, and to write an article. Not just to buy sample to sell them, that's a gem merchant. But a field gemologist is somebody who go to the field to do some gemology. Basically, you collect the sample, you return to the lab, and then you study them, and then you publish an article. That's the definition of field gemology. The rest is gem merchant, like Tavernier or many others. That's not exactly the same. So your article, your first field trip, was actually really field gemology, because you went in Tanzania and you wrote that article on green zoisite.
That's correct. Yeah, I was just, again, a lot of this is, fortuitous. When you're traveling, if you happen to be somewhere at a time when something new is discovered, and that pocket in block D of Marilani had produced this green zoisite material, and of course they had no idea what it was. There was some speculation, but they definitely didn't think that it was going to be, a green version of zoisite or tanzanite. And they called it combat at the time because of the color, because a lot of the colors were more muted, green, grayish green, not really the pretty greens that most people associate with it. And so it was, and there was a range of colors coming out. And in fact, at the time, there were also some yellows and some other colors that we didn't really know at the time what they were either. So in the article, we cover some of those other colors and how they responded to heat treatment. But the true pure green ones that were colored Bichromium really didn't respond to heat treatment, just like most green gems that we deal with. So we were able to get that material. I went and met with Dr. Barot after my trip to Tanzania and asked him about it. And he said, "Yeah, I've noticed some of these. I've bought a few of these pieces. I also think that it might be zoisite." So I took them back to the lab, to the Gublin lab, and we analyzed them. And sure enough, they were zoisite. So he and I then subsequently wrote the article that was published. I think that was 1992 in Gems and Gemology.
They are in block B, huh? Not D, B, huh? B like a Bravo.
D. Those came out of D.
Oh, out of D. Okay, I was thinking it was coming from block B.
Well, before we get into too many stories, I think, Edward, maybe you got to tell us a little bit more of your backstory, because we've already made several allusions to your grandfather, and maybe for some people they don't know the connection, or for the future gemologists that will one day be watching this on YouTube, they might not know what we're speaking about. So can you tell us a little bit about your family story and your connection with the Gublin lab and all that?
Sure. I was fortunate enough to be born into the kind of indirectly the Gublin family. My mother is my grandfather's oldest daughter, and he had 5 daughters, and so he had no sons. And when I was born, I was the second oldest grandchild and the first male grandchild that was born to the daughters. And so my mother decided, with my father's blessing, that I should be named after my grandfather. And that kind of started the entire fortunate situation for me. He was also my godfather. And so he, just from the very beginning, we had a connection that was unique. And he was my mentor. He was my, I was in awe of him. I was lucky enough to be able to live in Switzerland basically until I was in 2nd grade. So my first language that I ever spoke was Swiss German. And I've managed to be able to keep that ever since, because I've gone back so many times. And as Vincent mentioned, I got to work in the Gublin laboratory as an adult. And one of my second major in college was German. So just so I could keep up and grow my vocabulary. And so he would take me he loved to go hiking in the Alps. So he would take me as a child into the Alps and explain things to me about the geology of how the Alps were formed. And then we would look for minerals, mostly, quartzes, but there are other unusual, rare gem materials that come from the Alps. His doctorate thesis was on ruby from Campolungo, which is in the Italian Alps. And so there, believe it or not, there are ruby crystals that have been found in the Italian Alps of Switzerland. So, he knew a lot about that area, and he knew so much about the geology. And so I was fascinated by geology, not so much gemology at the time, but definitely, gemology and mineralogy and crystals. And so whenever there was an opportunity, he would, take me, and then he would also, we would, buy specimens, and I would receive gifts, specimens as gifts. One year I even received a little curio cabinet, which I then had in my room from the time I was, 7, 8 years old until I was a teenager, before I got a bigger one. But that's kind of where it started.
Okay. And so were you living in Switzerland as a kid, or you were? Okay.
Yeah, my mother moved us back to Lucerne and Meccan, which is where my grandparents lived, just outside of Lucerne, while my father was serving as a doctor in Korea during the Vietnam War. So he was a neurosurgeon, and he worked in a MASH unit in Korea that then would operate on the really serious, head injuries that would come in from the war. And then he subsequently, he did that for, during the course of the war. And then he moved to Switzerland for a little bit, but then went to study under a very famous neurosurgeon in Cologne, Germany. And so we continued to stay in Switzerland for that period as well. And he would travel back and forth to be with us and then go back to Cologne.
Okay, so then how did you end up getting to America? If you were
Well, my father then ended up finishing his residency at Grady Memorial in Atlanta, Georgia. So we moved back to Georgia, and then he's from Chattanooga, which is where I'm based now, and he always had the goal to come back to Chattanooga. So then we moved up to Chattanooga, and then I spent my formative years from third grade on here in Chattanooga until I went off to college.
okay, cool. So you
So
started in
you studied also geology in university, did
Mhm.
you?
I went to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which has a great geology program, and especially their field trips were wonderful because you have all the different types of formations, and it's one of the few states in the United States that has gemstones, and particularly ruby and emerald, garnet, um, and also hiddenite, which is a really rare chromium-rich spodumene. So it's a fun state to have gotten to study geology.
Okay. And after you studied with geology, so you went to work. How did you start your career?
It took 6 months and moved to, or 4 months maybe it was, and moved to Charleston, South Carolina, just to take a break. And I lived with my uncle in a show condominium, and helped him organize showings and sales of condominiums. And I quickly realized that I was not interested in that field at all, and that I needed to hurry up and decide which direction I was going to go in. And so I wrote my grandfather and asked him what he thought, if I should go on and study, get more education in geology, or should I pursue gemology. So he wrote John Quavelow, and John Quavelow wrote me and sent me the GIA application. And he thought it would be a good idea for me to do that in the interim, because he knew that I loved gemstones, and I had studied gems at my grandfather's private laboratory when I was 16, one of the summers that I was there. So he knew I was fascinated with that, and that he thought if I did that, that would help me to kind of transition and decide if that was what I would like to do, or if I would really rather go and continue my geological studies and pursue that direction. And so, of course, I went to GIA, and I never looked back.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. That's about the same kind of advice that I was given many years ago when I was still a tour guide, and I had a ruby and sapphire. And then I asked to a friend what I should do. He said, "Well, why don't you go to study gemology for a few months? Then you will know if you like it or not." Then, and after that, I never looked back. So, same story.
Kind of get hooked.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. So you went to study at GIA, and then what happened?
Then I wanted to stay in California, obviously, as almost everybody does. No matter where they come from around the world, they go to GIA and they try and stay if they can. And so I did. I loved it there. I was living in Los Angeles because at the time GIA was in Santa Monica,
Mhm.
and so I ended up interviewing with a number of different people. I interviewed in New York, and I got a job offer with a small company called Overland Gems that was very active in East Africa and Sri Lanka. And so I thought, wow, this would be a really great opportunity to learn about gem materials. They didn't really deal in high-end gemstones, but they dealt in nice gemstones, a lot of calibrated goods, and they even did heat treatment, annealing of topaz after it had been irradiated. So they had a number of different areas that were involved. They were extremely active in the different trade organizations, AGTA, ICA, and even the Women's Jewelry Association. So I became, and of course, American Gem Society. So I became familiar with all these different organizations. I got my what we call a certified gemologist today is through the AGS, American Gem Society, while I was with them. And I've continued that relationship ever since. And I think it's a great organization. It requires you to take an exam every year to kind of semi recertify yourself, and it just keeps you on top of the different things happening in the trade and gemologically. But I got great opportunity with them. I didn't stay there very long, but I learned a lot while I was there, and I kind of got a really amazing offer from Goobelin to come over and work with them in the laboratory as a lab gemologist. And so I couldn't pass that up. So I left LA, even though I was really just loved California, and I moved to Switzerland. And then I worked in the lab there, and I had a great experience. I actually started the same day that George Bussart started. So he and I became very quick friends.
Mhm.
I also was working under the director then was actually Adi Peretti. So we had quite an interesting team. It was a lot of fun every day. People that know Dr. Peretti know that he loves to joke around, and especially in the lab. So we had lots of fun. Charles Schiffman was still there at the time. It was a transitionary period where we were moving from a very small location that we had that was down on near the Leuven-Denkmal in Lucerne, which is a very famous lion monument. And we moved then into the new offices at the time for the Goobelin headquarters. And that's where the laboratory is even today.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
where I work. Nice place.
Yeah, and then I worked there for a while. I lived part of the time with my brother, who was also working for Goobelin in the doing some research and marketing and so forth. And then when he and I lived in a house together, but then he left, and so I moved in with my grandparents. And my grandmother, unfortunately, at the time was not doing well, and so I stayed there with them, and that was wonderful because I got to spend the last few months of my grandmother's life there together with her and my grandfather. It was a really great experience. And then I got recruited while I was in Idar Oberstein visiting some friends there by a gentleman named Bill Larson, who happened to be in Idar at the same time. And even, I'd even reached out to him before, right when I graduated from GIA. And he said, well, I think you should go and get some other experience first, and then we should talk. So that's what I did. And he then realized that I'd gotten quite a lot of experience, and he then offered me a position, which I also couldn't refuse. And I went back, moved to San Diego, and started working with him as a geologist, gemologist kind of situation. And, I was hoping it was going to, be a lot of gemstone mining, but most of the mining at that time with Pala had kind of been just at that point in and around the San Diego area. And he had pulled out of some of his mining operations in Sri Lanka, but we still had amazing opportunities there. And I learned a lot about just the engineering of mining and what's required. And it gave me a great basis to then be able to go out and travel and understand, how mining works, hands-on. You can read all about it and not understand the reality until you've actually experienced it. And luckily I didn't have to experience it with investing my own money, because Bill, I think at the time, was putting in about $100,000 a month into mining, which is, quite a lot.
And it's a pegmatite, which is
Pegmatite.
really, that's
Yeah.
That's, I think, the closest mining you can get to gambling. Mining
Yeah,
pegmatite.
you're right. Shooting in the dark, literally.
Oh my God.
Yeah, but he had a knack for it. He had a lot of people working for him. That John McLean, particularly his mine foreman, was extremely knowledgeable, and he was very cautious. He's very, you know, he was particular about certain things, especially when it came to safety and And so they were successful. Even in the hardest times, they would always hit something. I mean, you'd hit a small pocket of incredible pencil bicolors out of nowhere, or a nice big pocket of pink, crystals with green caps on them, or something like that. So I'll show you one of the early pieces that I got from there, which is this beautiful crystal here that's pink with a little bit of almost blue at the top, and then Clevelandite attached to it. So I don't know if
That's
you can see
cool.
that. But yeah. So that was really quite an experience to be able to learn more there. And then just being at Pala in general, they dealt in so many gemstones, and all really kind of high end, not as much commercial as other companies. And so I gained an enormous amount of experience working with them. Josh Hall was my immediate, boss, and he had a lot of knowledge, just hands-on knowledge. And I learned about selling and, how to negotiate and buying. Bill and I would go travel together to Bangkok. We would do trade shows together in Hong Kong. So we were buying and selling. We traveled together to Burma. He didn't go with me to Sri Lanka. He had gone to Sri Lanka and was there during one of the times that they had a bomb that went off in his hotel. And so he never really ventured back to Sri Lanka, because he focused really more on Burma, and became a world expert on Burmese gems and minerals.
Yeah. This is the first time, that Bill was the first gem merchant I ever met. When I was a student in Burma, one of the supplier from Bill was proposed me to study there. So he helped me to study in Yangon. And one day you had Bill Lasson, came in his office, and that was all the time a big event in Burma, because before Bill to come, people were gossiping like, "Oh, Bill Larson is coming." So then the price were going up and up and up. And then Bill was coming. Like, suddenly everybody was super excited. And then he came, and I heard so much about him. So when he came, I wanted to see who was the guy. So I was, and Uchota, that was the name of the guy who was helping me to study. Uh, told me, come, and so he introduced me to Bill Larson. So I came. I was wearing a longi, like I was studying in Myanmar, and I was looking like a funny guy. And I shake his hand and I say, "Well, I'm Vincent, and I'm a French guy." He say, "Oh, I know the biggest French mineral collector." And he crushed my hand. When he shake my hand, he really pressed hard. So I say, "Well, I don't know him." He say, "I knew you say that." And then he dropped my hand. He went to the office and he opened his jacket and he took a bunch of banknotes and he slammed the banknote on the table. He said, "I want to buy." And I was, "Wow, what is that guy?" That was my first 5 minutes with Bill Larson. I will never forget.
Bill actually was invited by my grandfather to join us on that first trip in 1993. And part of the reason, I asked him if he could do that was because I was working at PAL at the time. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to get more than about, a week's worth of time away. And it would be vacation time unless I was able to get my grandfather to invite Bill. And so it turned out to be, very fortuitous for both of us. And when Bill and I would go back and buy together, he would go in focusing primarily on the minerals, and I would focus on the gems, but we were buyers of everything. And that's what I think really made the big difference there, and why so many people were so excited, because we weren't just going in to buy the top end rubies and sapphires and spinels. We were buying anything. We bought, corner roofing. We bought, of course, spinels at the time weren't even really that big a deal. So we were buying up all the different spinels. We would buy topaz, phenakite. I mean, phenakite. Who buys phenakite? Well, we did. We bought everything, and we loved it. Even if we negotiated for something for $10 to somebody who was barely making $1 a day, they were thrilled, to get something where we would buy a $10 or $20 mineral specimen from them. And that then democratized the business, because before that, almost no one even paid attention to mineral specimens. Even in other parts of the world, nobody really cared. And they were so worried about buying gems because there were few people that understood minerals enough to be able to pay enough to keep them from being then destroyed and cut into gemstones. So we started, doing that. Bill, I can't give myself the credit for that. Bill really started that. And so he would pay a premium for a mineral specimen and teach them how to, when they took it out of the ground, to keep it pristine so there weren't any damages on the faces and the crystal edges that were really important to keep intact and pristine. So I think the excitement was because there was nothing we would not look at.
And he was not just doing that. He was bringing in Myanmar instruments and books and articles. He was never coming there empty. Most of my friends in Mogok or in Mandalay or in Yangon, they really like Bill, and because he was not just buying, but he was also training them. Actually, my very first GPS, I bought it in Mogok from Dr. Sanau, and Dr. Sanau told me that it was a GPS that Bill Larson gave him. So my old GPS that I took until it really died was the GPS that Bill Larson bring in Mogok, and many people there I met are super grateful to Bill, because he, I think, in Burma, in the old days, the only stone that people were looking at was rubies. Everything else was, even, for example, blue sapphire. The name blue sapphire in Burma is Nila. It means it will come blue, it will come red. But they were thinking that a blue sapphire was a ruby that was not yet ready and with the right color. So they were usually discarding the blue sapphire, putting them back in the mud and waiting for the stone to become red. So all the other stones were basically without value. So of course, when Bill came, that was Santa Claus. Bill was Santa Claus, he was buying everything. And people, many young people, especially who were not, you had in Mogok the big ruby dealers. But what Bill Larson was able to do is he gave business to a bunch of young people like Ucheta and many others, and he helped them to start a business. And then he democratized basically the kind of gem merchant or mineral merchant in Mogok, Mandalay, and Yangon. He really, I think, when we see, for example, the difference between Burma and Thailand, I was all the time very impressed, because the Burmese are very, very much interested about gemology. The Burmese dealers, they will study gemology. You have all these generation who have a feeling that gemology is something important. This is not something that you see too much in Thailand, in the trade. But I think this is from the influence about from Bill, from what I understand from when I was there.
Well, it goes way back. It goes all the way back to Payne. And it goes back to, gemology being something that was in its infancy, but they were discovering all sorts of unusual things. And, even my grandfather, he was extremely influential, because he would, when he bought, he also did that. He bought anything that was put across his, in front of him to purchase. He would buy, because he was mostly more interested in the inclusions and the association between the different gem materials and the inclusions he would see in the more expensive gems. And so he was probably the most prolific writer. If there's anybody that you can compare to the number of emails that we all send and receive every day, he probably was at the forefront of that in letter writing. And he would write people all over the world, and he would communicate with people in Mogok and Ratnapura and Muzo. I mean, he had correspondences with people all over, and he would constantly get offered materials from them, which he then would just buy. And he figured that the chances were pretty high that whatever they were sending him could have an interesting inclusion in it. And in fact, a lot of times they did, and sometimes they didn't. But then he would just either put the stone in his collection, or maybe he'd recut it or something like that. Um, but yeah, I think it began in Burma in particular with the British and their kind of thirst for knowledge when it came to minerals and gems, and particularly pain, because of his influence up in Mogok.
Yeah, well, from when I was studying in Myanmar, I studied in a small school called GGA, and
Hmm.
they told me that basically there was Anderson who came
Yeah,
in Myanmar and he trained 5 people.
Basil
My
Anderson.
teacher was one of the 5 guys who were trained by Anderson, and he started this school, the GGA.
Hmm.
But so you had this Anderson thing when he came and he trained basically 5 people. Uh, but then when I was picking around and trying to find out more about Gemmology in Myanmar at this time, the main name that was coming was Bill, because everybody, when they had an instrument, it was coming from Bill. When they had a magazine, it was coming from Bill. So they were all telling, "Oh, we are learning from Bill." And at this time, it was in 2000. Books were super rare in Myanmar. People had there was 1 or 2 bookshop with some reprint of books. They were making copies and they were selling copies of copies, but books were super rare, and then there was no internet.
Yeah.
So when Bill Larson came and every time bringing issues of Gemmology, a Journal of Gemmology, some article, I think during the 1990s, Bill did really a lot to make Gemmology more democratized in Myanmar. And this is what I saw when I arrived there in 2000. People didn't, they heard about the name Gubelin, but I didn't, I met only one person told me about Gubelin, about you, and it was Jordan. Jordan was the driver of Uchotang when I studied there,
Yeah.
and Jordan was your driver. And
Jordan was
Jordan
our driver,
told me,
and Dr. Sanong U was actually our guide.
yeah,
And
same
he
for
was
me.
actually, at the time, he was just a
Yeah.
doctor. But the good thing about him was that he was actually delivering babies and treating individuals on both sides. So he was one of the few people that could bridge the divide between the rebels and the government. And so, he was a perfect person to have along, because if we did run across any issues, he would be able to diplomatically get us out of it. And we then later traveled with him almost every time because of that. And then he then got into mining. He
Yeah,
tried all
exactly.
different kinds of mining, but he was mostly successful in mining unbelievable quartz crystals that he sent to China.
Mm.
But yeah, Jordan, the last trip I was there, he was our driver. He's an awesome guy. Awesome guy.
He's
I
everyone's
tried
Very
to
favorite.
get Jordan because
tallest
he's
guy at
one of our guests, but
Moga.
he's so no, I tried, but maybe he will listen to us. But he's in Thailand we say Krengjai. He's too humble, and he's probably the most honest person I know on this planet. The
Yes.
most honest and humble person I know on this planet is Jordan, and he's my Burmese brother because we have the same size. So when we are there, with in
He's tall.
Uchita, yes, he's two giants,
Yeah.
side by side, and it was great. Jordan, I still hope with all the situation in Myanmar that Jordan is fine. I'm thinking regularly about him.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Dr. Sanahu, something funny, he told me that his father was a Burmese general and his mother was an insurgent,
Mhm.
a communist insurgent. So that's why he started to, he could do the both way, because his mother was Shan and an insurgent, and his father was a Burmese general, a military. So he was from the beginning, between two. And this is why you see that Myanmar is actually a complicated country. Very
Yeah.
complicated.
He understood that
Yeah.
those politics very well.
Yeah.
Edward,
Bill's somebody you should invite to be on your program sometime, because I think you could it's a whole different story that you would get with Bill, and it'd be He's a
Yeah,
very, very entertaining guy to have.
I know about that. Yeah, Bill. Every time I meet Bill, for me, as I told you, I first book I get about gemstone was Ruby and Sapphire by Richard Hughes, but the first international gem merchant I met is Bill, and every time I see Bill, I remember that. For me, it was wow, the first one.
Yeah.
And no, I really enjoy every time I spend with Bill. He's great. I really enjoy that.
It's
Yeah,
fun.
we will think about that. I will. He didn't wrote any article, did he? Bill. I
No,
don't know.
he's not. He doesn't really write articles. He's helped in, a number of articles. He's done lots of editing, but he's not a big
We should have
big
thought
on
of him
art.
last year when we were talking to all pretty much minors. That would have been perfect. We could still do it, but we have to think about a way to get him
Well,
into the theme.
you could pick just about any part of gemology, mineralogy, or geology, and Bill would fit
Yeah.
somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we can. Well, I was already thinking about inviting in one of our coming talk somebody who didn't really write an article, but basically motivated me to write an article. So I think that okay, I keep
If
that
you
in
think
mind. I will
if you
invite
think
Bill.
about his website, Bill
Yeah,
Bill contributed all sorts of material to that website. You can ask Dick Hughes
yeah,
about that when he was the webmaster there. That Dick's brother and Dick and Bill collaborated on so many different incredible articles on that website, which are still accessible today. So Bill does it in his own way. He comes in and he'll grab this from his library and that from his library, and he puts it together and he says, look, here's what you should focus on. And I think this would be interesting to combine into an article and an update. And then,
He's
or
like
he'd
a
come back and he'd
muse.
hand you, from the latest trip to Burma, he'd come back with all these different little mineral specimens and, go through and figure out what they all are. And then they'd write an update. And so I think in a way he really has published, but probably I would say more online.
Yeah.
yeah. And that website, Palagem, was for many years my favorite website.
Yeah.
When I started Gemmology in basically 2001 at GA, because when I was in Burma, there was internet, but it was could not connect on internet. But when I started to study in Thailand, actually there were two websites, three websites with something about Gemmology. There was Palagem, and there was a website from Thomas H. Wang. That was the first website where I saw a spectra and something about that was looking like scientific. That was the two main sources. And Palagem was very focused on Burma. You had this Burma news, and every time, everything about Burma, about a gem deposit and things like that, you had great information there. That was the most up to date and accurate source of information about whatever happening with the Burmese gemstone.
Hmm.
And then you had a Thomas Inchon website at this
Yeah.
time. There was not much, but now there is so many things you cannot. There are so many excellent things online, a few bad ones, but most of it is actually excellent now.
Yeah.
Well,
But
And
you
maybe we
should
could
put a
focus on some instrument stuff, and
well,
because we're,
Edward,
we're already an
Edward,
hour into this.
yeah.
I can't
Well,
believe we've had an hour already.
before we get too far from it, I just wanted to ask a quick question because you were mentioning all those. He was your grandfather was a prolific letter writer. Are the letters still around? Has anyone thought about publishing some excerpts, or are they lost to history?
I have a lot of letters from him. I have many correspondences that he did in English. I have people that have actually sent me their collection of letters that they saved from him.
Okay.
One actually was from a woman who had met him in San Diego at the AGS conclave, which was held at the Del Coronado Hotel. Her husband had a fascination for gemology, and so they went to this event, and he and my grandfather became pen pals as a result, and they wrote each other for I think something like 10 or 12 years. and he then suddenly passed away. And his wife noticed that there was a letter still in the typewriter that he had started to write to my grandfather. And so she finished it and had to inform him, of course, that her husband had passed, but she wanted to continue the correspondence. And so he did that. And the amazing thing about this is that it weaves into, she then she was 82 years old or something like that when I started working for Pala. And one day a week I would go to the collector in La Jolla and work there in the store. And Pala made some kind of announcement about this, and she saw it, and she then uh, wanted to know if she could come and meet me and take me to lunch. And so of course I agreed, and she didn't tell me in advance why. She just said that she knew of me and wanted to get to know me. And then she then took me to lunch and she explained this entire situation. And and so she and I became close friends until she passed away in her 90s. But I mean, that's amazing. That's how it weaves. And there's so many different people that I've met over the years that have said, the one person whose letters I've kept in all these years are from your grandfather, because they were so beautifully written. And he did have an amazing ability to write prose and poetry. And as you know, from the from the photo atlas and the internal world, there's so many things that are written about gems and inclusions that are just, they're poetic. So
He was a kind of a Renaissance man. That's the way I remember him. I met
yeah,
him once. He was, I think, from my memory, he was a very curious guy,
very.
and he had many different interests. And I think, like, Justin and many people actually in gemology are fitting to this kind of thing. Gemology is touching so many subjects that most of the time it interests people who has a wide curiosity, and it attracts people with a wide curiosity. But yeah, he was for me kind of Renaissance guy, like a Da Vinci, a guy with a lot of knowledge about many things.
Mm.
Oh yeah,
And
he collected Roman glass, Russian icons, carvings, artifacts from Egyptian tombs. He had pieces from Tutankhamun's tomb. He was really, like you said, he was really a Renaissance man. He spoke 8 languages, and he could read and write, all those. I mean, it was truly amazing. He had a secretary that would come in, and he had a English secretary and a French secretary, um, that would come in and help him just make sure that when he was writing an article or a book, it was edited properly, or if he was writing letters, to make sure that it was all done correctly. But yeah, it was incredible. I,
Wow.
I
and
just,
he developed instrument.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
He developed instrument. He
And he
developed.
developed instruments. Yeah, he worked, actually, he consulted Zeiss on many of their gemological instruments that they then created for gemology, because they weren't really designing microscopes for gemology. They were designing them for optical mineralogy, and obviously for microbiology and things like that. So, and in fact, he helped develop and create a microscope for my father to use while he was doing neurosurgery. It was one of the very first microscopes ever used in the United States. And it was because of him that he helped him work together with Zeiss, and he could operate this microscope. It was like on a cantilever system, and he could then use his forehead to move it back and forth, and his jaw to then change focus, and he could then have both hands free to operate. And so it was one of the very first microscopes used for microsurgery.
Wow.
Yeah,
Really?
and he financed that. It was quite expensive to build that, and
Wow.
he financed the entire thing for my dad.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
What was your main? Because you spent a lot of time with your grandfather. He was your mentor. But what was the main thing that you you will thank him for you. He influenced you on which way the most? What did you maybe it's a bit,
He introduced me to the beauty of the connection between gems and minerals and the earth and geology and how everything formed, and the interconnection between the different geological forces and the way things would mineralize in the earth, and then how you could then look at those, and if you understood how they had this that you had indicator minerals that were then entrapped within certain gemstones, that you could then identify the at least the mode of formation, and then sometimes if you were really good enough and you studied long enough, you could identify some of the geological and geographical locations, and then sometimes even the actual mine itself if it was unique enough. So I would say the fact that he introduced me to all that, and that helped create a passion for me, and in gemology. I think the thing that really triggered for me the most was when I was 16 years old. He set up a little laboratory for me in my mother's old bedroom in Meccan in their house, and it had a microscope, a refractometer, a scale, which we then set up for specific gravity, and a spectroscope. And he said, I want you to go through, he would bring up one tray at a time of his gems. And he had a massive collection of reference material that would include, let's say, I don't know, 50 different colors of the same variety of gem. And then he would also have maybe 15 examples of ruby from Mogok, and 15 examples of ruby from John Saul mine or whatever. So that he would then say, okay, look at this, do all the tests on it, and write in this little book. So I would write in the little notebook my notes. But the number one thing that he insisted that I do, which was initially it was a bit monotonous, but then I started to realize how amazing it was that he wanted me to draw what I saw in the microscope. He said, I don't care, you don't need to identify what it is. I just want you to draw what you see. And so I would do that. And then he would come and sit down with me, and he'd explain exactly what I had drawn and why it was important. And that's probably the single most impressive thing that stayed with me, was being able to do that. And I didn't look at inclusions as individual items or individual characteristics, but I looked at the entire scene first. And I think if there's anything that I could pass on to other gemologists, is that when you look at the photo atlas, which I think is, obviously for me, it's the number one thing that you should study. This is volume 2, very thick, loaded with all sorts of information. Obviously there's 3 of them. And if you really want to use gemology, field gemology, lab gemology, whatever, the first thing you have to do is to educate yourself so that you can actually identify what you're looking at. But you can start the way that I did, and you don't have to know what you're looking at if you just draw what you're looking at. And then as you start to do that over and over again, and you look in the photo atlas and you compare what you've drawn to what you see in the photo atlas, you can really start to educate yourself, which a lot of people have done to great success. Some gemologists, I think, have surpassed, this. When I say my grandfather, it's my grandfather, and of course John Quavala, who you also have had as a guest, who's also one of my mentors. I was lucky enough to I consider him a really close friend, and his wife as well, and his daughter, and but the 2 of them created something that was, I think, unparalleled. But there are other gemologists out there today that are using, all sorts of advanced ways and stacking, software stacking, things like that, where they're creating images that are unbelievable. And, Billy Hughes, many other gemologists are out there doing that, and it's limitless. What's the possibilities of educating people about how to identify gems, but learning how to do that first in your, in your head, in your own lab. And then the thing that I think is most important for those that want to go out in the field is every time you look at a gem in the microscope, and you've mentioned this, Vincent, that even the most advanced lab gemologists, once you put that same gem in front of them with only a 10 power loop, that's a whole different scenario. You just don't have the detail. So you have to practice in the lab with your loop and look at that same inclusion and be able to ascertain what do you see with that loop or that dark field loop, which I think is the best instrument for the field. How does it compare? And there's some images, Justin, that I have of the dark field loop that we can share. But just to kind of show people, if you're using your dark field loop or your loop and you're getting these kinds of images, are you able to pull them up?
Yep, I'm pulling it up.
Then,
the dark field loop is well, it's my favorite instrument because, as you know, I went to Burma with 3 books, including the photo atlas, and then I had this dark field loop, and I was looking at this inclusion, and basically a dark field loop is a pocket microscope, and if you have the chance basically to study gemology in a school, in campus, you have a microscope, a great collection of gemstones. When your gemology study are finished, and even if you don't have a microscope all the time with you, you can have a dark field loop. And anywhere you go in a trade show or in the field, if you see any faceted stone or a rough stone that has a polish fracture or something like that, you can actually see inside, and you can use that as a pocket microscope. So the more knowledge you have about inclusion, the more useful will be the dark field loop. A dark field loop is useless if you don't have knowledge. But as I say many times to people who ask me what is the best instrument, in the field, I will say a head full of knowledge. Because if you have the knowledge, then you will be able to take advantage of the instrument you have with you, like a dark field loop, a Dicroscope, or whatever. But the dark field loop is just wonderful because of the beauty of what you see.
Yeah. And the same holds true with the spectroscope, but we can go to that in a minute. But if you look at these images here, it's not just the actual, on the one on the left, yes, and the one on the top. When you have individual crystals, obviously there's not a whole big scene that you're looking at. But we won't go into the details of each of these, but it's apatite on the left and spinel, and obviously rutile needles and a Sri Lankan sapphire. On the top right, it's a spessartite garnet and topaz. On the bottom, it's an anatase, full, beautiful euhedral dipyramidal anatase crystalline quartz. And then the top left are negative crystals and spinel. They're just simple examples, but these are all pictures that were taken through a dark field loop. They weren't taken in a microscope. So you can really get a lot out of that, and I'll see a lot of detail. The other instrument.
Sorry, you took this photo with a mobile phone, did you?
That's correct, except for the one on the top right. That one was taken with an SLR camera.
Okay, because I think you were the first person who communicate on the internet about taking inclusion with a mobile phone.
That's right. I wrote an article for the Journal of Gemmology on that. And actually the pictures, the 2 spinel pictures on the far left, are from that article that I wrote, and showing people how they could use their cell phone. Because I know a lot of people don't have, like I have separate oculars on either side of this Zeiss microscope that you can take a picture and you can look at the gem at the same time, the inclusions. But some people don't have the access to, a high powered digital camera. And our mobile phones today have such incredible resolution. If you can put it over the ocular and you can figure out how to hold it properly, and my article does address all of that, then you can take great pictures. And most people just want them for documentation purposes. So, but you can publish them. You know, people. If
No,
I'll tell you a
especially
picture of
on
my
the,
grandfather that comes from Professor Michel. There's a black and white picture from Professor Michel. That's one of our images that we can show in a minute. But it was taken
that
through an ocular as well, and so you see the circular image, which is kind of why I started doing that with my phone, because I that's how I could capture this circular image. But this is one of the very first inclusion pictures ever taken of an emerald, showing three-phase inclusions. And this, when he was studying these emeralds, that's what fascinated my grandfather. So my grandfather studied under Professor Michel, and Professor Michel is responsible for uh, introducing my grandfather to microphotography or photomicrography.
when
And
was that? What year was that?
this was in the uh, late 1920s, early 1930s.
Wow. Okay.
So they had a full lab already, um, they had a gemologist working for them, and my great grandfather had done some studies with Professor Michel, so he thought it was important for my grandfather to go and study under him in Vienna. But I thought it's fun. It's fun to show this. This was what he saw when he was inspired, because they didn't have color images, so it was all black and white, and it got him super excited, and that's why he decided to, from that point forward, that his focus was going to be on inclusions and gemstones.
One of the great thing about your grandfather is, okay, he was focusing on inclusion, but he was also traveling a lot. At this time, and still now, many lab gemologists are not really traveling too much.
Well, he had a
But he
dual
was.
role, you know, like I have a dual role, and that I have to buy from my company to be able to make money, and
Mhm.
then I take every opportunity I can to study material that I've bought that isn't going to be something that I might sell, but something I think is really fascinating. And he was able to do the same thing because he was buying for Gublin, for the retail stores, and for the atelier. And at the time, in this, you know, in his heyday, between the 50s and the 70s, they were making all sorts of amazing color gemstone jewelry, and they won all sorts of awards. And they are now refocusing on that, and they're creating some amazing jewelry again. And you know, it takes a focus of being able to purchase the material and understand the value. And for him, because he was at the source, and at those times there weren't as many overlapping characteristics, you know, he could, and he wasn't being offered things that got brought in to Burma from some other location. He, you know, at the time, if you bought it in Burma, it came from Burma, pretty much, unless it was some kind of synthetic. And if you bought it somewhere else in Sri Lanka, pretty much it came from Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka, you know, just only, it hasn't been long since they started legalizing the importation of rough, because they didn't want any kind of conflict with their own material they were producing. But now Sri Lanka has become such a big cutting center, and they import and export rough from all over the world. So now you can't really be guaranteed, if you're buying something in Sri Lanka, that is actually coming from Sri Lanka. So you have to really do a lot of testing and be on the ground. But that's, you know, the way things have evolved.
But something fascinating about your grandfather and about gemology is that at his time, so he started the Gobelin lab basically to protect the Gobelin family and the Gobelin business from synthetic treated stone and things like that. But
Yep.
at the same time, he was also a gem merchant. So many people see currently you have, if you are either a gemologist or you are a gem merchant, but you are not really you know, you cannot be both. You cannot basically becoming a when you work in a lab, you cannot compete with the customer of the lab, so you cannot be a gem merchant. But at this time, Dr. Gobelin was one of the world or the most prominent gemologists, but he was also a gem merchant, and he was traveling to Myanmar, he was traveling to Sri Lanka to buy gemstone, which currently you cannot do. I don't see a leading gemologist nowadays being at the same time a gem merchant and a lab gemologist. That's
Yeah. And
basically,
he
yeah,
traveled freely in Afghanistan and Pakistan when there were no real issues with traveling there, and he collected all sorts of sample materials in Brazil. Um, he was very active in the IGC, and so they would have their meetings at very usually at gem producing localities, and they would always have trips after that, and he would go on buying trips after that or before. Um, and he also taught for the Swiss Gemological Society, so he would then collect things to then help the gemologists in Switzerland uh, learn more about treatments and new gem discoveries and things like that. Um, but you mentioned something interesting, and we could flip to there's a picture. There are two pictures. One of the Fremy crucible with rubies, synthetic rubies, and then one of the pearl endoscope. And it's kind of interesting. You mentioned that there was a period there. It started in the late 1800s, which this image here that you see is out of a book that Fremy wrote on his synthetic ruby crystals that he grew. That
mm,
there were actual crystals, not just flame fusion boules that then came along later. But this was back in the late 1800s. This was published in 1891. So in the late 1800s, he was already growing synthetic ruby crystals. What really started causing problems in the gem trade globally was the introduction of flame fusion, which Verneuil
yeah,
introduced in the early 1900s, and that then combined together with cultured pearls. We have an image of a desktop instrument which was called the Pearl Endoscope, which is on the bottom right,
yeah,
which was every major laboratory. GIA has one, Gubelin has one. Of course, when there was a British gem laboratory, they had one, and they were probably the foremost laboratory in the world when it came to the identification of pearls. And of course, you mentioned Anderson was there. He was their expert on spectroscopy. Um, there were so many different amazing Whittlesworth. There were amazing English gemologists that influenced gemology at the very beginning. Basil Anderson, my grandfather, were very close friends, um, and Crowningshield and my grandfather were also close. So they all communicated with each other, and they advanced the identification of cultured pearls, because that combined with synthetic rubies was causing chaos amongst the retailers in the jewelry industry. In fact, Shipley, not Jim, but Robert Shipley, who started GIA, was a retailer and had experienced so many difficulties with the introductions of these synthetic rubies and cultured pearls that was his motivation for actually starting the Gemmological Institute of America, to educate jewelers across the country and around the world about how to identify these gem materials.
mm,
The picture on the top left is actually a portable. It's called a pearl scope. It employs the exact same uh, technology and methodology that you see in the desktop version. It's basically very simple. Light gets sent through the pearl into this little needle. It's reflected from one part of the needle up and then through, and there's another mirror on the other part of the needle. And if the light travels through, once you get to the center, it won't, because you just have a nucleus that's usually just some kind of piece of pearl from actually, ironically, the Tennessee
yeah,
freshwater
yeah, most,
mollusks were used and still are used today. um, so the light would no longer travel once it got to the middle across this arc, and then therefore you knew you had a nucleus inside the pearl. Now today, of course, with the freshwater pearls and just using tissue nucleation, that's no longer possible. But back in the day, that's how they were all done. So this challenge is what really introduced forced the entire industry to go into what we call modern gemology. And modern gemology started with these challenges that that today seem extremely basic and simple because we have the knowledge and the ability to identify these things readily. We're still challenged, but I just thought it'd be fun to introduce the whole concept of how we got to where we are, and that portable instruments really were also important in those days, but have become more and more important today. The next instrument that I would focus on might be, unless you had a question, might be the Dicroscope, because obviously the loop and the dark field loop, the loop that I use, a lot of people want to know what I use. I use this loop right here, which is it's made by Gemmology Pro. I don't know if they're still in business or not, but it was designed by a friend of mine who's a physicist. His name's Dr. Horst Krupp, and it's an aplanatic lens, which means that it's basically a triplet lens where you have a sphere in the center, and then you have two sides that then come on either side to then minimize distortion around the outer edge. So it's an unbelievably well-designed loop. It actually has screws here where you can actually, as many gemologists know, when you're looking at a gem, you might accidentally touch the edge of the gem and then you scratch the edge of your lens. So you can take them out and repolish them, put them back in. It also has a silicone washer that's right there that helps it to just move smoothly, but doesn't become loose. It has a interesting mechanism that pulls up. I don't know if you can see that, but it pulls up and you can put your lanyard through that. I carry this kind of lanyard because I can detach it. So I can easily detach it, and then I have the loop all by itself, and I don't have to have the lanyard. I just leave that around my neck. So that's a wonderful, there are many different loops that Zeiss and GI, there's so many different loops out there, but the key is that you have one that doesn't have the distortion around the edges. So
this is like the most high-tech loop that's ever been made. It's a good loop.
It is. That one probably is. Yeah, I would say.
Can you buy those, or that's just a kind of a one-off for you?
They were available for a while until Dr. Krupp got sick. He unfortunately passed away a number of years ago. So I'm not sure. The ones that I see out there are just what people have themselves. I only have two left. So I used to think that they're just going to be available, but they're not.
No.
Another loop that my grandfather always used was this Kruse loop, which is kind of fun to see. This one actually has a 10 power plus, let me just make sure that I'm describing it correctly to you. So it can go, this is 10, and this was 20, the small one. And then if you put it over like that, you can actually achieve 28 power. You can't achieve 30, but you can achieve 28 power. And that's the Kruse loop. So that's a really fun one. And you'd see many pictures of him holding this loop. That's primarily what he used in his travels. He also used this little one right here if you just wanted a single loop that was a 15 power. Very simple. I don't even know who made this, but
it's like a super light. That's a minimalist backpacker style, super small loop. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Traveling in these days was not easy. You had, it was not as simple as nowadays. And traveling was
all the other gear was really heavy.
It was.
He traveled. When he went to Burma in the '60s, he traveled up the Irrawaddy.
Did he have like a steamer trunk, and he was traveling like really old, fashioned way? Wow, this is crazy.
Yeah.
It was taking days to go from Yangon to Mogok. How many days it took him?
I think it took them almost a week going upriver, and then coming downriver, it was only a couple of days. But he went with my mom in '63, and they took a bunch of photography and film equipment, and he actually did a film on Mogok and mining, which I would think is probably one of the great preserved documentary films on what mining was like in those days, because it's changed dramatically since it's much more mechanized today.
Yeah, and this is, what he did was exactly it helped me when I went to speak with a GA and I tried to get, a cameraman working with me. I said, well, Dr. Googling was traveling to Mogok and to Sri Lanka with a crew, and this is why, he was able to get this image. It's not just sample, but he was bringing a lot of data, and I think that that was a kind of cool idea. And if he was able to do that in the 1950s, maybe GA, we can do that in 2012.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, uh, I was able to get the budget.
That was a coup. It's a good thing you did when you did it.
Yeah, that was one of the things, but well, one of the many things, because of course, regarding the collection, it's when I first went to Lucerne, I was working with Henry Ho at this time. It was in 2002. And Henry one day told me, Vincent, why don't we go together to Europe? I would like to meet Dr. Googling in Lucerne on Emmanuel Fritsch in Nantes in order to see what we can do, and because I want to see the collection of Dr. Googling. So we went to spend 3 days in Lucerne. There was this big hotel just near the lake where your grandfather was staying, and then he made all her collection come. And for 3 days, I spent with Henry some time
Yep.
watching at the collection and listening to your grandfather telling the stories about this trip, because we were asking about this stone and he was telling us many things, and it was just amazing. That was an amazing time. It influenced me a lot when I saw this collection. And he said that every gemologist has to get a collection. And then some other people told me that. George Bossert told me that. And then Henry and he told me that. And Ken Scarra told me that. So all the, a gemologist in the old days could not be separated from his reference collection.
That's right.
All the old timers had a reference collection. If you don't have a reference collection, you are not a gemologist. Now you have many lab gemologists, they don't have a reference collection, just a job. But in the old days, that was not exactly the case. So you had to get reference collection on and that's why I started basically my reference collection. When back from Lucerne, I was very impressed. I was very impressed.
Yes, and maybe you could pull up the picture of my grandfather in his personal lab in Lucerne, and then maybe also the one of him holding the ruby in Mogok.
So there he
Yeah.
is.
This is his lab in Lucerne in the hotel that Vincent was just talking about. He had one large room that he converted into his own personal lab. Obviously, he had retired from Googling and from the laboratory many years before. But while I was working in the laboratory, he would come by several days a week, and I would tell him, hey, we're working on this particular stone, or we have this particular issue. We're curious about in this heat treatment of rubies, there's some synthetic ruby crystals that look to be growing in voids. And he would come in with all sorts of material for us to then have as comparisons. And it was invaluable for me, and I think also for the lab team, that he would constantly come in and share from his own reference collection. And as you can see, he has every conceivable instrument that you can imagine in his lab. And this is just a very small corner. He had a desk designed with, you can see the curved desk, so he could just turn and use the different instruments. But to his right, there's an entire table that was about, I don't know, 10 or 12 feet long, full of gemological instruments. And my desk was at the very opposite end, where I could sit and work. And then he would allow me to, grab things. And my uncle and I created a database for his gem collection, because he needed to have something that he could, refer to on the computer and have printed out for him. But yeah, this is what a reference collection was critical for him. It's always been critical for the Google and Gemological Laboratory. It's critical for me. I have many of his non-commercially important inclusion gems in my collection. I have thousands of gems with inclusions that he photographed or studied over the years, and I refer to them quite often, particularly if there's something that I'm reading an article about something I'm curious and I want to see it, and myself, I can look it up, and that's invaluable. And then today, you mentioned Henry Henney. Henry Henney has taken Raman spectrum of all of his personal reference materials, and I imagine so has Dr. Peretti. Of course, GIA purchased a majority of my grandfather's gem collection, and they have published everything that they've come up with, every spectra, every kind of gemological property and characteristic they have available online for any gemologist around the world to look at.
Yeah.
So
No, that was the thing is, Dr. Goulding, when he did his reference collection, it was not exactly the type of reference collection like the one I'm doing, because his reference collection had also some gemstones that were gem quality. Me, usually, I don't have budget for my collection. Usually, I'm more focused on, I want to be sure that the stone is coming from this place. That's the most important thing for me. And because now there is trace element chemistry, even if the stone is very small, it's better to have a 10 tiny stone than to have one big one, because you get more data, statistical data, with 10 small stones than with one big one. But I was very impressed in Dr. Goulding collection when I visited it in 2003. You had spinels that were gem quality, 5 carat, 10 carat. You had a lot of stones that were today that this stone will be very expensive and will be totally nearly out of budget for a normal gemologist. But I think that at this time, many of these stones were actually, especially in Burma, they were not, people were not valuing stones that were basically outside of ruby. So all the stones that were not ruby were basically without a market. So the collection that he was able to build was super impressive. And you have to see that when I went to visit Dr. Goulding, I was just out of gemological school. And when you go to a gemological school, this is not the place where you will see high quality stones, because I don't know any gemological schools that can afford to provide to their students some 5 carat or 10 carat clean ruby, sapphire, emerald. When you go to a gemological school, all the natural stones are tiny or full of inclusion that you cannot. It's gemology by name, but you don't really see gems except maybe the synthetics.
Yeah.
because no gemological school have the money to provide to their students fine quality stone for their studies.
That's
which
true.
is a big challenge when you go to the trade and you have to work with actually stones that are in the trade. So when I saw the collection from your grandfather, I never saw that before. That was the first time actually I saw a collection of fine gemstone. Was a collection of your grandfather.
Edward, somebody asked real quick, is the GIA Googling database available online complete, or is there more data somewhere else? Or is there data somewhere else?
What they have published is what they have completed thus far, but they have not completed all of the spectral characteristics and all other gemological characteristics of the entire collection, because it's thousands of stones.
Yeah.
But they've picked out the ones that they thought were, initially the most interesting and most unique. And it's called the GIA Gem Project.
Yeah.
Also, I'm just curious, when you would, when you would visit your grandfather, or when you guys would speak, what language were you guys speaking in?
Mostly Swiss German.
Okay.
Yeah. If it was something that was really complicated and I couldn't quite understand what he was saying, then it would be English.
Okay.
But we would switch back and forth, but mostly Swiss German, because I wanted to continue to practice Swiss German and then also use gemological vocabulary, which is, obviously completely different from what you can normally study. So yeah, mostly Swiss German.
Cool. Okay. Just
And my
curious.
mother and I still speak Swiss German together, which is great because it's our own little language that we can speak and nobody else knows what we're talking about. So it's kind of fun. But hey, let's get back to some of these portable instruments. The next one I wanted to talk about was the Dicroscope, because I think, the Dicroscope is, Vincent's always focused in these talks on, what are the three instruments, I think is what you've said in the past that you would take with you. And for me, it would be the loop. If I had a choice, and I don't only take three, but I take if it doesn't all fit into this little bag, then I don't take it. So this is what I take with me and carry with me everywhere I go. It's about, it's small. Everything fits in it. You'd be amazed how much you could fit into a bag like that. But anyway, I take always a dark field loop, always my loop, a Dicroscope, which we'll focus on next, and of course a portable spectroscope. The Dicroscope is one of the simplest tools to learn how to use, and requires the least amount of actual, teaching. A loop is infinitely more difficult to master. So if you want to start with the simplest, you might want to start with a Dicroscope, because it will teach you the basics of gemology. So you can differentiate the optic character of a gem and determine whether it's glass, where it doesn't have any, it's singly refractive, or if it's something else like a ruby or a spinel or something. If it's a ruby, it's going to have pleochroism, so you're going to have two colors that come through, like you see in this image here. Or if it's a garnet, you wouldn't, or a spinel, you wouldn't. So you can't really identify much with a Dicroscope, but you can differentiate and start that process of elimination. And that's the key to ultimately identifying what you're looking at, is really process of elimination. And in this picture, I just picked this because it's kind of fun. This is a unusual combination of pleochroic colors, and I chose this because if you go to Madagascar, there's a very rare gem called pisodite, and it has there's some unique qualities to it that you can see visually if you know what you're looking for. But it looks very similar to pink tourmaline, and many of the pink tourmalines being sold in Madagascar, at least when right after pisodite was found, were actually pisodites. And so you could go and buy a pisodite at a pink tourmaline price. That was quite a find. So this is a pleochroism typical pleochroism of a pisodite, which it shows an orange and a kind of a purplish pink, which you would not see in a tourmaline. And so that would be your first indicator that you could look at and say, wow, I may be looking at pisodite. And then you can start focusing on some other characteristics that are a little bit different, refractive index and so forth. But the Dicroscope, is critical. The next instrument that I would say is important to master, but probably the most difficult to master of any is the spectroscope. This is a handheld spectroscope. And now this picture, while out of focus, shows you pretty realistically what you see when you look through your spectroscope. Obviously the lines are going to be a little bit better. It's hard to photograph a spectrum without a special setup. But I wanted you to see, it's not about the individual lines. I mean, you need to know what the individual lines are and why they're there, but it's also why it's not really always just about the individual inclusions. It's about the entire scene. So it's the whole picture. So if you can master looking at a picture, and I think our ability as humans to look at something as a whole, and then identify who that master is of a piece of art, is much easier than if we just focus on a 1 square inch of that piece of art and say, well, who's the artist? Well, it's the same with gemology, I think, and the same with these instruments. And one of the great tools, again, books and magazines are the other portable tools in your gemological arsenal that you need to have, because they provide the initial knowledge that and experience that you need to be able to apply those tools. But this is a great book on that focuses on spectra. And what I like so much about it is tables of gemstone identification. What I like about it, of course, is that it shows actual color spectra with all the absorption bands and lines and so forth. So it's a really detailed. Of course, it lists what they are, but it shows you color images. That's an important one. There's a new one that I'm actually doing a review on for the Journal of Gemmology, which is Gemological Tables, which is about to come out by the German Gemmological Laboratory in Idar. It has incredible information, detailed information about everything from RI to SG and spectra, but there are no images. So that's the one thing I love about the other book. There's, of course, the blue chart of gem identification, which also has incredible amounts of information, wonderful images at the back for you to study. So that's this book here, blue chart. And then while we're at it, just because I think it's important, if you can subscribe to, mineralogical record, for example, if you want to keep up to date on the latest finds in the world, no matter what they are, whether they're important gem or not, you'll find it in this reference material, and it's detailed, wonderful articles with incredible pictures. The others, of course, are Gems and Gemmology. I'm on the editorial review board for Gems and Gemmology, and then, of course, the Journal of Gemmology. There's the Australian Gemologist. There's Lapis Magazine. There's so many different publications. So I'm not just promoting these. I'm just saying, in general, as Vincent's mentioned before, if you have a working knowledge of these gem materials and where they're coming from, and what's possible, and you get tricks for how to identify them using these different instruments, that's the key in being able to be a good field gemologist, and applying what you know from what you've studied into the field and practicing in your private laboratory before you go, using those instruments so you familiarize yourself with those scenes, whether it's spectral scenes or inclusion scenes of what you might be looking at.
Yeah, knowledge is only heavy when it is in books, but when you get it in your head, it's super light. And that's the most powerful instrument you can get, is knowledge in your head, not in your library. So basically, you have to read the articles, the books, and everything. And the more you read and the more you look at the stone, you have to read, look at the stone, read, look at the stone. And then after a while, when you have this working knowledge, you can, with confidence, go to the field, and in most of the case, you will be able to, using simple instruments, as you say, there are some stone. It's absolutely diagnostic when you see with the Dicroscope, violetish blue and greenish blue on a blue stone, it's sapphire. Period. There are some stone. It's so easy to identify with a pocket instrument because you have the knowledge. If you don't have the knowledge, you have no idea what you are doing. So that's true. That's true.
Edward, there was a couple of requests. Can you show us those books again, and I'll write them into the chat so people can look them up?
Yeah. So this is Birgit Günther, Tables of Gemstone Identification.
Gunter, okay. Gunter with a G?
Gunter.
Okay.
Umlaut.
And then what were the other two softer ones?
This is the blue chart gem identification. I have to put on my glasses. I'm sorry.
Okay, I think that's enough. You could type that into Google, I'm sure.
Hervé Nicolas Lazzarelli. It's that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what was the third one?
This is one that's about to come out called the Gemological Tables by the German Gemological Institute in Idar Oberstein. And it's Hen and Melisenda and Stefan. Stefan,
Yeah.
Hen, and Melisenda.
Okay. Those are in
All
the,
very respected gemologists. And then, of course, the magazines you got, right? The
right. Yeah.
In Record,
Yeah.
Gems Gemology, Journal of Gemmology, Australian Gemologist.
For me,
Then
and
there was the chart A and chart B from GIA that I really enjoy because it's so simple. It's just a page with, very light that you can put in your suitcase, and when you travel, you have that. Now, of course, with that, you go online and you find a lot of things online. So you can just download the PDF in your mobile phone, and then you have everything with you, which is again super light.
Yeah, and that's I would do. I'd recommend that to download. Take if you have these charts, take pictures of them and put them in a file, and then you have access to them. If you have a question about a gem, and you're not having to purchase it right there and then, and you can go back and look at your information in your hotel room that night, or if you're in an office, you can ask them to just excuse you for a moment while you look up some things. They don't have to know what you're looking up. Just look it up right there, and you have it at your disposal.
Yeah. I know for me in gemology school, the spectroscope was the hardest of all the tools that we learned. I never got good at using the spectroscope.
Yeah.
Luckily,
it's the same for everybody. That is the hardest for sure.
It's about practice.
Yeah.
But as you were saying just before, it was with a webinar with Antoinette. We spoke about that. I have this all the time. My GIA. I don't have it with me today, but my GIA dark field loop hard box that I really love, because you have a foam inside, and when you put the instrument, they don't move. So it's not like in a pocket. When I'm in the field, I'm walking a lot on all my instruments or destroying each other. I hate that. But my old GA dark field loop case, that was a hard box with some foam inside, and you have the space for the maglite, and then the dark field loop, the tweezer in the middle, and then I carve a space for my 10x loop, and then I can put the Dicroscope and I can put the Spectroscope. So that's what I have. I just travel with that, plus that. Because with that, you have also the GPS, and you have all the PDF you want that you can store, in your mobile phone, and basically you can just check the information when you need it, and you can even check Google Earth and see exactly where you are, and you can find out, on the other side of the hill there is a place I want to see. Why? Because I can see on Google Earth on my mobile phone, and it's a kind of very useful tool.
So,
while we were talking earlier about reference, I just wanted to show you how I organize my reference collection. So it's in trays, and each gem has, information on the back side of the box that tells you what it is and where it's from. But this has everything from corner rupine, rhodochrosite.
Do you say where you get the stone from? You put it. Do you remember where you get every stone from? Do you put that on your on your information?
I do. If it's just the country, I have just the country. If it's from one of the mines, I have the mine actual locality. Like one of these chrome tourmalines I have from this one here. Oh wait, this one here is from self-collected from Landanai in Tanzania, which I've gotten the rough and then had a cut. This is what the rough looks like from that particular locality.
Are you putting on your box that you bought this stone this day at this place, or you just
if it's one that I bought at that place, yes, I put it on the box.
Okay. Yeah, because this is one of the things that I saw in many older collections. Many people, they say, oh, this is a sapphire from, for example, this place in Madagascar. But in the old days, nobody was putting the day they were getting the stone or the place, and if they collected the stone themselves, and the condition where they were getting the instrument, the sample. And that was the problem I saw in many reference collection, so-called reference collection, because when the person who collected the stone was still alive, he could tell the story, oh, this stone, but most of the people never wrote this information. So when the people retire or pass away, all this information about where actually the sample were from was gone.
Yeah.
And that's a disaster in terms of reference collection when you don't have any more the information about how, where, and when. What I call the 4W: where, when, how, and from who the stone was collected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because there is all the time, on a lab point of view, if you know that, for example, this stone was collected in 1975 in Sri Lanka. Well, 1975 in Sri Lanka, there is one thing you know, it's not coming from Madagascar. Because the sapphire mine in Madagascar started in the early 1980s.
Right.
So when you know that the stone was collected in 1975 in Sri Lanka, you know that it's very, very strongly, on the Sri Lankan side. Now, you still cannot say if it was heated with blowpipe or not, because you know that heat treatment, like low temperature, was ongoing for 1,000 years. But the information about the date and the condition, about of how you collected every sample, it's super important. And this is the most easy information to put. You remember I acquired this sample in Tucson that day, and I bought it from this place.
That's very true. Very good point. Yeah.
Edward, do you ever use a Chelsea filter? Somebody had asked.
Yeah.
I do have a great story about using the Chelsea filter for the first time when it saved me $20,000. I was in Tanzania, in Arusha, and I had been told about this amazing tsavorite rough that had been found. And I looked at it and was truly amazed by it. It was probably going to cut about a 20 karat gem. It was, looked like a normal piece of tsavorite rough that I'd seen many times before. It was exceptionally large, but other than that, it, really wasn't something that was unusual, except for the size. I couldn't see any inclusions, so I was a little concerned about that, because almost all the tsavorite I had purchased, always had something, and tsavorite has a very unique inclusion characteristic that, is pretty identifiable. So that gave me some pause, and then so I pulled out my Chelsea filter, and it was bright red under the Chelsea filter. And I had already noticed that it was a little bit on the heavy side. So if you really, get great at this, which happens over time, Vincent can tell you there's some Burmese that can actually tell you the weight of the stone by putting it on their tongue. You can do that. You can heft a stone with your hand, and if you're really good at it, you can tell the difference certainly between what this ended up being, which was a yag that was fashioned to look like a piece of rough, or if it was indeed a garnet. Yag is much heavier, just like zircon is much heavier than most other materials. But you can even get good at differentiating topaz, for example. And I have a picture of some topaz, but it's not necessary if we pull it up or not. But that whole skill is another, it's a more, it's something you truly can't teach. It's something you just learn over time. But the real skill is to allow your gut to give you pause and force you to not get too excited about thinking, wow, I'm going to cut a 20 karat gem out of this, and it's going to fetch this many thousands of dollars a carat. And you get caught up in that and you get in trouble, because that can sometimes supersede your gut that says, hey, I better do another test. And all it took was one more test.
Mm.
So this $20,000 piece of rough was really worth, $20, if that. So yeah, that's just another fun story. The Chelsea filter is an extremely useful device, um, and I think it's something that you can use if you learn how to use it. Just like if you learn how to use some other filters that are out there. The Hanneman has developed a number of filters. I actually carry his whole set with me. It's because look at how much room it takes up.
Mm.
Less than a few credit cards together. They're all on a ring. Um, they're all, let's see here. There's the synthetic emerald filter on the bottom, and then what they call the I think he calls it the backup filter or something like that. I don't ever use that support filter, but there's all these, and he has all the descriptions on the filter, the adjoining filter description that goes with it. This is the Aqua filter, which is actually pretty handy, and the Ruby filter. So filters can be very helpful, particularly if you're at a trade show and you're walking by booths and you want to just use your filter, or if you're, wanting to do a quick second test, like the test with the Chelsea filter, it's very handy. If you Hanneman and Hodgkinson have developed lots of different techniques. Hodgkinson in particular has a technique that's if you look at my article, towards the end of the article, there's a photograph of a diamond, and I think it's CZ. I wanted to use very simple, obvious examples, but they're submersed in water, and there's a light that's shining down through a pinpoint, and it shows you the dispersion, right? Well, Hodgkinson has come up with a way, and he teaches people how to do this. And if you practice it, you can do it yourself. You can take a gemstone, put it in your hand, you can put it up to your eye, table facing your eye, and the light that comes in from the sun will hit the stone, and it will actually create little prisms. If you put it up close enough to your eye, you can actually see the prisms, and you can see how they're dispersed in a circle. And the combination of understanding the distance between each prism and the spectral colors coming from the prism actually can give you an indication of the refractive index and the dispersion of the stone. So if you become good at it, talk about something that takes a lot of practice, but if you become good at it like he is, it's shocking the gems he can identify by just looking at them that way.
I think he can almost give you the RI number, if I remember correctly. Like I remember him talking about that when we were all in Zermatt, and he was there as well, and showing people that in the lobby, and I was just like, "This is crazy," but it works. It's cool. It's really
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, and it's just understanding, optics and optical mineralogy. That's another thing I meant to mention was, when I studied geology, I was fascinated by gemology, obviously. So I focused on optical mineralogy, and I love to collect minerals. So if you understand minerals, so that's why I mentioned, the mineralogical record or lapis. If you understand minerals, then as a field gemologist, you're often given pieces that are portions of a mineral where there are some faces left, if it's not just purely a very alluvial deposit. And there's so much that you can ascertain from understanding the different morphologies of minerals. But then if you go further and you understand the optical properties of that particular mineral, then you can start to put it all together and it becomes gemology. And I think that all these different uh, faculties or aspects of gemology, mineralogy, geology, they all come together into the overall knowledge that you need in the field. In the field, you really have to have a working knowledge of all those faculties, because if you don't, somewhere you're going to get stumped. And if you want to improve your ability in the field, I would say the number one thing is to start collecting minerals, because then you really understand the basics and where all these different characteristics actually come from and why they're there.
We were discussing about that with Justin, because Justin is a cutter, And we were discussing about the importance of studying gemology and studying optics for a cutter point of view. You know,
Mhm.
if you are a gemologist in the field, you want to identify what you are looking at, it's better to have some gemological knowledge, because then you have an advantage. Because as you say, you can, for example, find some pesotites in a parcel of tourmaline, and then you know that you will be able to get a better return on investment if you buy pesotite for the tourmaline price. But if you are a gem cutter, if you want to cut a stone, to be able to understand how light is, working with the crystal, then you know if this stone, you will be able to orientate it this way and which kind of color you will be able to get. If you understand how light play with a different type of crystal, with a different type of crystal system, and you have 7 of them, then you can also get a very good return on investment, because you will see, oh, this stone I can cut and I will get that. And this stone, there is a problem. I will not be able to get a return on investment because of that. So learning gemology, there is a lot of application that depend about how you make a living with your gemological knowledge. If you're a cutter, if you are a lab person, if you are a gem merchant, or if you are a mineral collector. There are many different things, but all of them are related with one thing. It's about taking knowledge out of the book and putting the knowledge in your head.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
true.
Yeah.
Edward, I'm curious. One of the things that we're doing a lot in the world of labs and in the school is refractive index. So, does that ever, how does that work in the field? Do you ever use refractive index, or
Sure.
is it not useful in that context?
I mean, in the field at the mine, not at all, but unless you get a perfect crystal. But then usually I can identify it based on the crystal morphology. So it's more if you're looking at cut gems and you're in a let's say you're in Bararula, or you're in an office in Mogok. When I come, a lot of times there are people that have found something that they don't know what it is and they want me to help them identify it. So I always bring, as much as I can to do that. And a refractometer obviously is one of the great instruments that we can use. Um, oh yeah, you have the pictures there. That's great. So
I was just trying
I
to give you a way to show the pictures.
you know what I love about this is that the one on the right is is one of the early portable refractometers. I'm holding it now, so you can see really how small it is, and it's a great tool. You can switch back to the pictures. I just wanted them to see relative to my hands how small it is, and that's an English refractometer using a hemicylinder. And then the one on the left is actually a GIA. I have it here in my hand as well. And so you can see how small it is. It's basically the size of a big silver dollar. And it has a moving lens that you can look through with a polarizer that you can attach on there. And it even has these little inserts that I'm not going to pick up right now, but you can put them in here so that the light coming through can actually be polarized. So there's all sorts of applications for that. But a refractometer allows you to just, differentiate so much more or confirm your suspicions of something. The big problem is traveling with RI liquid, but I have a tiny little vial that's about half the size of this spectroscope. It's about this big that I can carry, and it has just enough fluid because all you need is a drop, right? And it has just enough fluid to where it couldn't be dangerous for anybody. But you can pack it into your bag. It's insignificant because you only need a drop or two at a time. But that's the critical problem with trying to get refractive index is that you have to have the RI fluid, which is considered a toxic.
Yeah.
That's liquid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a very useful tool. I particularly use it if I'm traveling, to trade shows and things like that. I also have a portable laboratory that I take along. It's like it's a briefcase basically. It's by a company called Portal Lab. It has everything built into it. It has a microscope, really, really high quality spectroscope, UV lamp, refractometer. I have all sorts of things I've added to it over the years. But it's funny, Vince, you mentioned one story about, how Bill brings instruments. He and I brought, we always bring loops and things like that for people. I sometimes bring little head lights for them to wear in the mines and so forth. But one time I brought a Portal Lab, and one of the guys that I was trying to buy a gemstone from wanted his gemologist, which was what's his name, the famous gemologist from Burma, who's also really good friends with Bill. Huntoon. Yes, Huntoon. So he wanted Huntoon to have the laboratory. And so we traded the gem for my Portal Lab. And so that remained in Burma. And it's interesting because it's only been in Burma that anyone has had enough interest in gemology to want to trade for the Portal Lab, because I've taken it to Tanzania, Brazil, Sri Lanka, and no one's ever made that offer to me. And it was a tough thing to do because I loved my Portal Lab, but I figured, this is going to be something great for him. And he really did use it a lot. So,
and those aren't.
Burma is, you're right. It's a kind of a special place about that because out of except maybe Afghanistan, out of most of the gemstone producing country, this is a country where I've seen the deepest interest for gemology. Most of the time in gem producing area, people are not very much interested in gemology, except in Burma. And in Burma, you have a lot of people who are seriously interested in gemology. Maybe this is because you have so many different gemstones. You have 80 different types of gem mineral in Mogok. So people like to, and you have many people who are collecting Burmese gems there, and they want to identify the stone, know what it is, because also they can make money. If they have a rare stone, it's something very, many Burmese gemologists are really after a rare stone, and if they can, identify a stone like Chotu, who found, Chotutite, and then you become somebody famous in Myanmar because you were able to find a stone. Like at one period, it was about penite. If you were a penite owner, there was only 3 or 4 penite in the world. If you have one penite, wow, you became, everybody was looking up to you. So many Burmese gemologists were super motivated about studying gemology and getting some instruments so they can get an advantage.
I remember when I was consulting at GIA when they were building the museum and doing the exhibits in the hallways, which I worked on. They had a painite, and they were one of 2 public institutions. One was the British Gemological Laboratory had one in their collection, or GEMA, and then and GIA. And so when there was that big find that was made, I think it was 2003 or something like that, maybe 4. I ended up getting one. I have it right here. I thought it'd be fun for people to see not only the gem right there, which is a little over 2.5 carat, but this is the matrix that it comes in. Isn't this crazy? It's nothing that you would ever want to pick up off the ground, I think. But these,
and there are rubies. There is ruby with it. You have rubies with in your penite?
This one does not have rubies with it, but you can see the crystals. I'll point them out with the crystals are right here, there, and there, and there. There's even one over here on the side. There's one right there as well. But yeah, there are some that had rubies interspersed with them. But yeah, it's still a rare gem, but it's not as rare as it used to be. Just like Tophite is not quite as rare as it used to be. Remember my grandfather, when he had he had a 13 karat tophyte in his collection. It was the largest in the world for decades. And then all of a sudden they found a bunch more.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. You can be out there and you can be lucky, and you can find something, and you can find something at a trade show too. I'll give you another great story. I was in Tucson exhibiting, uh, I think it's 5 years ago now, and one of the gem dealers had a green stone in his booth, and it was labeled as a chrome tourmaline. So I said, "Can I take a look at that?" And he pulled it out and he said, "Sure." And I looked at it, and then I was looping it, and I noticed some other colors coming off of it. And I said, "Are you sure this is a chrome tourmaline?" And he said, "Absolutely, I'm sure." I said, "Well, what's the price?" And they gave me the price, and it wasn't, it was up there. It was over 1,000 a carat. It was a beautiful green stone. So I went back to him and kind of negotiated a price, because I already knew that it was not a chrome tourmaline, but I
Mm.
wanted to let him know, but I wanted to negotiate the price first. And so I did. And I told him, "Look, this is a different stone. It's a green tanzanite." He said, "I've never even heard of that. What is a green tanzanite?" So I explained it to him, and I offered to, let him keep it if he wanted, but he decided he wanted to sell it. So I purchased it, and it became part of my collection. And I have a number of green tanzanites in my collection, but a few years ago, Bill had wanted to add something to his collection, so he purchased it from me, and it now resides in his personal collection. So it's kind of a fun story.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
There is, when you think about the cost in time and investment about studying gemology, some people think that it's expensive, but actually, I heard about many stories of people who didn't, or they studied gemology just to have a paper on the wall, and then they went to a market, and within one weekend they made a mistake, like your $20,000 tsavorite,
Mhm.
and basically they made a mistake in one weekend that was more costly than all their gemology studies.
Yeah.
So when you think about it, it's really a good investment for anybody, whatever you are going to do associated with gemstone, either you are going for cutting or trading, or of course labs, but also maybe marketing or things like that, to spend 6 months, studying seriously about that.
Mhm.
And I want to add something, because this is something that was not actually in my geological studies, but the first time I heard about it, it was from your grandfather, and that really uh, became an evidence to me. Is when I was in Lucerne in 2002 with Enrico, and after spending 3 days looking at the collection of your grandfather, he asked me, we had a lunch the last day, and he asked me what was the most fascinating for me. I was just a young guy during these 3 days. And I say that the most fascinating for me during these 3 days was that 3 times he answered my question with, "I don't know." And I say, well, that was very surprising for me, because Dr. Gublin don't know. And he looked at me and he said, "What is the difference, in your opinion, between a good and a bad gemologist?" And I say, well, a good gemologist try to know as much as he can, and he will get a lot of knowledge, and he will read everything, and he will study a lot. I say, no, 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 no. A good gemologist knows when he has to say, "I don't know."
That's true. Yeah.
And and since then, I learned that in the French gemological school in Paris, when they give the 20 stone exam, there is all the time one stone that they are not able to identify. So there is one correct answer, which is "I don't know." And I found that absolutely great. And I would love to see more gemological school, in their 20 stone exam, putting a stone where the correct answer is "I don't know." Because the most important thing when you are in the field, even if you have a lot of knowledge, is still to be able to say "I don't know" when you don't know. You
Mhm.
taking risk is so bad. You have to know the limit between what you know and what you don't. So then, you see a stone like your garnet, your YAG, and then you look at this and say, Tsavorite, yeah, but maybe not. And you still have to know, and it was great, that you thought about that in order to, okay, I need one more instrument to be on the safe side. And then that was this instrument that bring you the answer. No, it's not Tsavorite. It's actually a YAG. And that's
Yeah.
one of the
Sometimes
most
it's
important thing I
more
learned.
important what not to buy than what to buy. Just like if you work for other companies, often you may learn what not to do rather than what to do. So I think you're right. That's a good thing to live by, is to be always a little bit, you know, be inquisitive, be cautious, and definitely uh, base your decisions on what you, as you narrow down the field, and don't get too excited about, what if, if it's going to get you this return on your investment. Make sure you're always second guessing that and double checking.
Well, in Burma about that, when I studied in a GGA with Wu Ko, we didn't have refractive index because there was no liquid in Burma at this time. So we had to do all the thing with a pocket instrument without a refractive index. But many times, when the whole school thing was about to identify stone and to buy stone in Burmese market condition. So, for example, there was a classic thing about, is it amethyst or is it scapolite? You cannot make the difference just like that. Because one is a, a uniaxial positive and the other one is uniaxial negative, and that's the main difference. But with just pocket instrument, you cannot. So if you have a stone that you suspect to be maybe scapolite, where it could be amethyst, actually the trick from my Burmese teacher is, in any case, you go for the cheapest version. So if you think it's capolite, you have to buy it. If you buy it for amethyst, it's okay. Then you go back at home and you check in your lab. But in any case, if you don't buy the stone, there is one thing you will never know. So you have to buy the stone in order to go to check if it's actually scapolite and you are right, or if it's just an amethyst and you were just maybe excited. So you have to buy the stone. If not, you don't know. You will never know.
I'm going to surprise you with an instrument that actually John Quavala introduced me to, that may be the simplest instrument in all the portable instruments, that would actually allow you to differentiate between amethyst and purple scapolite. And I'll show you. I meant to mention it earlier, but so this is a Polaroid filter. Mm-hmm. And it has an orientation. It's kind of like, it's similar to, people probably know a quartz wedge filter, right? Mm-hmm. So if you can get, using this condensing sphere right here, anybody see that?
Endoscope.
Get the condensing sphere, and you can take the gemstone and you look at it under polarized light, and you orient it until you find the interference colors. You put the condensing sphere above the stone. You have to hold the stone and the condensing sphere at the same time. And then you insert this filter. If the filter goes blue in the first and third quadrant, it would be uniaxial negative. And it goes in the second and fourth quadrants, it would be positive. I believe that's what it is. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head right now. But if you look in my article, there's also an example of that in that particular, towards the back end of the article, that references this little combination of tools. Again, it takes a lot of practice to locate the interference colors in anything. But if you look through the girdle of the stone is when you're going to find the interference figures, because typically the table is going to be perpendicular to the C-axis. So you go perpendicular to the table or perpendicular to the C-axis, and you'll find the interference colors. And then you'll be able to insert this little thing, and it'll tell you if it's uniaxial, positive, or negative. And you can even determine biaxial positive or negative using the same technique. So that's just something. It's complicated, but if you really want to know between those, you can. It can be done. Yeah.
I learned not to do that too much in Myanmar because the trick was my teacher there was telling me, you should not do a thing like that when you're in the market.
Yeah.
Because if you do that, everybody will bring you all the stones they think they have no idea about, and you will not get the stone you want, but they will come and they want to know for free if it's natural or synthetic. So they bring you the stone and they will, and then you will test the stone and you will tell them.
Yeah.
And basically, you will not be able to buy the stone you want. So the key point, and Henry Rowe, who was my boss at this time, and he was teaching me how to buy, was saying me, well, if you when you buy stone, you are in the field, you look too much interested by what you buy. Number one, the price will never go down. And so it will be very difficult. So you have to look very quickly and make your opinion very quickly. And the trick is, okay, you suspect it's a scapolite, buy it for amethyst, and then it will be okay. But you don't check in front of the owner before to buy the stone. First, exactly like you did with the green zoisite, you negotiate the price first, then you buy the stone, and then you double check as much as you want, because now this is your stone. Mm-hmm. And that's the funny thing, that we were playing a lot in Myanmar, and it was fun with that. When I spent 4 months, morning I was studying Gemmology, and in the afternoon I was either learning lapidary or I was in the market with another gemologist. His name is Uchewana. He had a small lab and he was playing chess. So we were playing chess, and then stone were coming and we were looking, and it was like playing chess, If I was excited, he said, no, you don't have to be excited. You have to be like, no reaction, like a poker face, and with your knowledge inside, and then you're computing.
Yeah, that's right.
I learned a lot from the Burmese. I really learned a lot from the Burmese. It was just great.
They are shrewd traders, that's for sure.
Yeah, and but it's exactly that. And I think most of the Burmese gemologists and biogemologists, they have this kind of thing that, again, your grandfather had, because one of the interesting things in Myanmar is that most of the gemologists there are also traders. So they buy stone and they trade stone, and they're also gemologists. So they see a very practical thing about being a gemologist, because in Myanmar, you cannot just make a living out being a lab gemologist, because reports are very cheap. So if you are just a lab, it's very difficult to make a living. So most of the gemologists I know are able to make a living because they're also buying stone. So
absolutely,
it's a lot of stone, and it's a fun place.
They all do. Yeah.
So Edward, our time is getting crazy here, but I had one good question I still wanted to ask before we finished. So you told us a lot about your story and your grandfather and being associated with the Gubin lab. So one of the things I was really curious about was, was there one point in your career where you decided that you weren't going to be a lab gemologist and you were going to be, because you're not a gemologist technically, right? You're a gem trader. You're a merchant more than a gemologist at this point in your career, right? Or is that not true?
I would say that I'm a combination of all the above. I mean, I'm constantly working on editing, I'm on numerous editorial review boards. I'm always doing research of my own, trying to write articles. Most of my articles recently have been very short because I just don't have time to do the full-fledged articles, but I've done that over the years. I consider myself kind of a balance, but I would say definitely, 75% of my time is spent on gemstone acquisition, trading, things like that, because I have to in order to support my family.
Yeah.
I don't have the luxury of having, a big company behind me to allow me to go out and buy and sell. But but I'm fascinated by both, and I wouldn't be able to do just one without the other, because for me, the passion comes from the gemological side of it. I'm not passionate about buying and selling. I enjoy buying, and sometimes I enjoy selling. But honestly, I enjoy looking at the gems in the microscope. I love the challenge of trying to identify something, figuring out where it came from. I do love holding and handling beautiful, fine quality gemstones. So it has to all come together. I recently started consulting with Gublin on a number of different projects, and what that does to bring passion back to you is something I can't even really put into words, because I I it was painful for me to leave the laboratory, and go to work in a different end of the business, but I needed to have that experience, and that experience came along at that one moment in time. And I think if I hadn't done that, I would be a lab gemologist and I'd still be in Switzerland.
Mhm.
But it came along. I took the opportunity, and I don't regret any of that. I would have been probably happy as a lab gemologist, but I don't think I would have ever been satisfied, because of the background that I came from with my grandfather. And my goal was to ultimately achieve, in many ways, what he did. And that was to actually be able to do all those things, to buy and sell, travel, meet all these amazing people around the world. And as a lab gemologist, you're really limited in your ability to do those things unless the laboratory can financially support that. And then you have to be fair to your other colleagues so that they also have time to travel and do research. So, um, as my own, boss, I get to dictate that. And while I may not make as much money as I could, I certainly get to do what I want, go where I want, and focus on what I want. So it's been a great career thus far, being able to do that.
Yeah. Well, let's think that was a great answer. Thank you. That I was really curious about that because just thinking, okay, the grandson of Gublin, he didn't go to Gublin, so I figured there must have been a story. But I guess it's really your whole life story, right? One thing
Yeah.
to another thing, and took you into all
Yeah.
different places.
And now I'm back working with Googlin again, and it's been fabulous. And I think things just kind of evolve. And as long as you stay true to your passion, um, things just kind of fall into place over time, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
I,
Well,
I, I think I think
sorry.
that your grandfather, Dr. Goulding, he created the Goulding Gem Lab, but he didn't work um, really so many years in the lab. I think he was mainly, he created also Gem, like the gem trading company. And he was also doing both.
Well, he
He
was
was,
the buyer. He was the gemstone buyer for the company.
yeah.
He worked, personally directly with the various designers to help them pick stones and create the jewelry masterpieces that they created. So he was intimately involved, and of course he was the oldest. So for a while he ran the entire company. He was, president, CEO, but he then his brother also, Walter, who then subsequently took over when my grandfather retired, also ran the company together with him. And then when Thomas took over, my uncle, my grandfather still came into the laboratory to visit, but he wasn't working in the lab. So yes, you're right. He was wearing so many different hats that he didn't spend all his time in the laboratory, but whenever he could, he obviously was in the lab,
Mhm.
and enjoyed it very much. And he collaborated with many gemologists around the world. He even had Dr. Henney and Dr. Peretti doing all sorts of advanced gemological testing on his own personal research stones that he did. He did Raman on. He did EDXRF, because at the time in the early '90s, EDXRF was one of the main tools that we used for chemical analysis, and we would combine that with spectral information. And in those days, you had a Perkin Elmer spectrophotometer that would print out a a spectrum on a piece of paper. So, you know, it was pretty fascinating. That picture you showed before, there were two. One was of him, a great picture of him in Tanzania,
Yeah.
and the other one was a picture of him holding a ruby. It's a national treasure, ruby crystal that belongs in the National Museum in in Myanmar, in Yangon, actually. But that's actually in the background. That's the military compound that we stayed in the early '90s, that he and I snuck out of. That Vincent showed you. I think he posted that picture of us in his longi, which
Yeah.
he traveled with, and the one that I had to put together from a bed sheet on my bed. And we
Yeah.
snuck out of the compound as a couple. He was, of course, I was the husband holding my arm around him as if he was my wife. And we shuffled our way out of the compound and we went to visit some friends of his, all, of course, unbeknownst to the military guys that were there, that were supposed to be keeping us from mingling with the locals. But we had a great time doing that. Um, Another story that we can end on that I think is always really fun to tell is that we would go out and we would go visit all these different mines, and we'd be out all day. And, you know, it's pretty arduous, as Vincent can tell you. Even if you're in a vehicle, you're bouncing around. And in those days, there was a Jeep that they had, an old American Army Jeep. We called it the
Yeah.
Painmobile because it had terrible suspension, and that the roof was fixed through by screws that they had screwed through the metal into wood. And you'd bounce up and you'd hit your head and pop, the screw would go into your head. And one time George Bussard hit it and it literally put a hole in his head. Um, anyway, we'd ride around all day. It'd be 10 hours of going in and out of different mines. And we'd get back and we'd all be just exhausted. And we'd, you know, everyone would say, well, what time are we going to meet at dinner? And my grandfather would bounce out of his vehicle, and we looked at him. He had so much energy and he looked 20 years younger. We couldn't figure out what it was. And it was the dust from the roads had turned his white hair brown and his beard brown. And he literally looked 20 years younger. Of course, he had so much energy, more than any of us combined. But I always love to tell that story because he was in his element when he was at these mines.
Yeah, I read that story in a book that was written by a former assistant from Henry Ho. I think her name was Carol Clark. I think she
Uh-huh.
was. And she wrote that story about your grandfather in Mogok, that he was, I think you went to Bernardino, which was far away at this time, and you had to pass all the, you know, the pass near Tomedong Mountain, and that was a really long way. And on the way back,
That's the paradox come from there.
yeah, near the Peridot mine. And you were exhausted. The people were exhausted when they were coming back. Some people were complaining, but there was one guy who was not complaining at all, and he was saying, "Well, that was one of the most beautiful days in my life." And all the other one, what are you speaking about? And I think that this is, for me, this is. I remember that because there is one thing I really don't like in the field is complainers. I hate people complaining. But when you go after a long day and everybody is tired and you see people happy and nobody complain, I say, oh, that's a great day. No
Yeah.
complainer. Everybody is. We are going to bed soon, but everybody's happy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Edward, can I just do a couple of like rapid fire questions from the audience so we can,
Sure.
everyone feels happy about that.
Yeah.
Are you associated with any university?
No.
Good. If you were on a desert island with only one tool, what would it be?
My loop, because I could use it as a magnifying glass to start a fire.
Okay. When you were talking about tools before, are you using all of them together or sometimes just one or the other?
Depends on the stone in question, but I always use my loop. I mean, I always examine a stone with the naked eye first, and then look for characteristics like reflection, you know, reflectivity, dispersion. If there's any kind of conchoidal fracture or step-like fracture, if I notice any kind of cleavage planes. Then I look at it with the loop, and the loop, of course, helps me identify those characteristics as well. But then you start to dive inside the stone and see what you can see through the loop. If it's a cut stone, I'll use the dark field loop. If it's a piece of rough, I'll use my own loop. One of the things that I like to tell people is that, you know, you got to have a mag light as well, or some kind of light like that. And you can actually take a gemstone. Let's just say you take one of these unusual, like here's a big unusual tanzanite. Okay, it's kind of a greenish yellow tanzanite, and you can take it out. And let's say you want to look at the pleochroism in this stone. Well, you can hold it just like this, table to cue it, and hold it sideways over the mag light, and then take out your dicroscope, and you can obviously turn it in different directions, immediately determine that it's trichroic, right? You can also, if you don't have a dark field loop, you take it and you wrap your finger around the stone and allow the oblique illumination to come through the pavilion or through the girdle of the stone, and then you hold your loop up like this, and then you look into the stone like that. So I do this more than anything else when I'm in the field, more than looking through the dark field loop, because that gives you the initial kind of indication of what you're looking at and the different characteristics that you might be looking for. And then I would add the dark field loop if necessary.
Okay.
Or the spectroscope.
But also with the dark field loop, there is a limitation to the size of the stone you can put in. So sometimes it's much safer to hold it with your finger with just the mag light under, because if not, with a tweezer, you cannot just put it inside.
Right.
The stone.
Absolutely, you're right. Yep.
So
I also always bring a little bit of blue tack with me, and then so if I need that to help secure a stone either over a light or over the dark field, where it could just a stone that's this big, you could put the blue tack around the outer edge and just set it onto the dark field, and actually that's the actual optimal focal length for the stone to the loop, and then you can see into it pretty well. But you're right, Vincent, there's a size limitation. It's particularly difficult using a dark field loop with rough. And so you have to get good at wrapping your finger around the rough, holding it in over the end of any kind of light source that you have, and then look at it that way is much more effective. Or you've shown, I think, in the past, the rechargeable lights that they use in Thailand and Burma, and those are the best for looking at rough because they have such a high power and condensed.
They're a small beam.
The noble
I use also, and I wish I have it in my car and I forgot to bring it with me, but I use a Welsh Allen portable fiber optic illuminator, and it's basically the length of a mag light. It's a little bit thicker. It has a rechargeable battery that you can put in it, and then it has a stiff fiber optic arm that's about that long, basically, and I hold that up to the stone obliquely, shining usually through the girdle of the stone, and then use a loop. And that's extremely helpful with things, like if you're looking for rutile, or if you're looking for example, in spinel, there are lots of small fractures that you may not see in a spinel, and there's a lot of oiling going on of these fractures. And so in order to locate them, you really have to have a fiber optic illuminator to be able to see it, or some super high power light source like what Vincent uses sometimes in the field. They get extremely hot though, those rechargeable ones, and this fiber optic one does not get hot at all.
Yeah, that's the good thing with fiber optic, or the torchlight that they have in Mogok. The great thing is you have the on button that cannot stay on if you don't hold it.
Yeah.
So you just click click, and it's a very powerful, and it doesn't really stay hot because you just it's not about turning on and it's on
Yeah.
all the time and then it gets hot, and
Mhm.
also it weighs the battery. So
Yeah.
the normal torchlight that is done by one family. It's a family business, and he's doing this torchlight. This is the best torchlight for rough that I ever saw, and it's not super surprisingly. It's in Mogok. He just answered to a need from
Yeah.
all the ruby and spinel dealers there, sapphire dealer, to deal with a rough stone. So
Yeah.
it's a great that plus Optivisor. It's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all too. Justin, I'm sorry, I went a little long on the answer there. What are your other rapid questions? I'll try and be quick.
Flashlight, yellow or white?
I always use yellow because I've just always used it, and because the LEDs don't work with a spectroscope.
Okay.
And in the
Um,
recent years, with the yellow light, when you are using, for example, a mag light, and you're using a Darcy loop, this is great to find out if the stone is color change.
Mhm.
yeah.
Also,
Yeah,
yeah.
Have you ever?
Alexandrite, any kind of a color change. When with your Darcy loop, you check and you see the color changing. But because of the backside of the Darcy loop, the other people around, they cannot see what you see. So you know it's color change.
Mhm.
Nobody else know. So this is one of the great things with Darcy loop with this incandescent light, is that you can see if a stone is color change or not
Yeah.
Yeah.
without anybody to know.
Yeah. Have you ever tried using the polarization of the sky to see if a stone is anisotropic in the field?
No.
No, but I use the polarizing of the screen of my computer, of my mobile phone, and with just some glasses that are polarized, and then you can put the stone between your computer and your glasses, and then you can basically you have a polariscope, which
Yeah.
is quite easy. Then if you want to use a conoscope, it's much more easy in that thing that using a tiny
A slide, yeah.
polariscope. Yeah.
Well, plus I
I have
think
a polariscope that attaches to the end of my mag light, which I use.
okay.
Um,
Well, I
and
think
then
in that situation though, if you wanted to see if a stone was anisotropic, the dicroscope would be faster, right? I mean, you would just
like that.
done.
Yeah, but
My
microscope,
dicroscope is,
uh,
you saw how big it is. It's tiny. Has a great field of view that's about the size of a dime, which is plenty for looking at rough. And it also has this my particular one has a 3-time magnification lens in it as well. So that's how that picture was achieved of the
Yeah.
Pizzota showing the pleurochrosm.
Somebody else has the same one as you. I really like that one because it's got the two halves of the circle instead of being just two squares, which is the one that I've got. Mine's okay,
And
but yours is you can see it so clearly when you've got half half and you can
yeah,
turn it and it's really I love that one. I don't know who makes it, but I've seen other people have it. I'm like, oh, I like
yours
that.
is a calcite
Yeah.
one,
Yeah.
which uses the properties of calcite, and that's why it's like that. This one is using polar filters oriented perpendicular to each other,
Okay.
and is very simple in its concept. But this one is also one I have was made by Gemmology Pro. It also even has a little spring mechanism in the end that you view so that you don't break the lens if you touch it up against a hard piece of rough. Um, but
Clever.
I don't know if Gemmology Pro is still making these or not, but he made high impact plastic ones that were about $85, and he made these really beautiful like steel ones that are much more durable. At the time, they were around almost $200. But yeah, you can do all sorts of things. You can borrow a friend's pair of glasses and use your glasses and cross polar and create a spectroscope just like that
Yeah.
if you have to. So
Okay. Mark Langston says you're making your grandfather proud. That's a good way.
thank you, Mark.
And last
Trying.
question. This one is not a rapid fire question. It's a little bit complicated. So let me just present it to you. So he's saying there are many labs in various remote countries around the world, like Afghanistan, Iran, etc. People are often dismissing them or looking down on them, even though they're, run by people that have been trained. Let's say GIA school. How should we perceive these? What do you think?
Well, all right. So there are laboratories that are what we would call internationally recognized laboratories that adhere to very strict guidelines and, of course, have extremely advanced testing equipment, very knowledgeable gemologists. Um, and even though, they may be internationally recognized, they're not free of fault or making mistakes. Um, and so no laboratory is perfect. Um, Laboratories that are from, let's say, producing countries are limited often because they probably don't have the equipment, the advanced equipment. Maybe they have a GIA graduate or an FGA or what have you. But as Vincent and I just explained, that's just the beginning. When you get your degree, that's the very beginning of your career as a gemologist. It's not the end, not the middle or the end. It's the beginning, and you learn every day, and you learn from experience. And you have to have training that goes beyond that in order to be truly an advanced laboratory gemologist. Now, many of these people have experience in the field that supersedes any experience that some of these laboratory gemologists have in the advanced labs. So I would argue that in some aspects, they may know much more about certain gems and localities that than, say, a gemologist would working in one of these internationally recognized labs, but they may know more just about their particular area and maybe not as much about what could come from other locations. So they have advantages and they have limitations, and the internationally recognized labs have advantages and they have limitations. So my belief is we should all treat each other with respect and base someone's opinion as in its particular context and what they have at their disposal. And maybe they make the right identification, maybe they don't, but that doesn't mean that they're not a good gemologist or that they don't mean well. And that holds true for even the finest labs in the world have made mistakes. And as long as you recognize, like Vincent said, when my grandfather told him that he didn't know something, as long as you recognize that there's a possibility you don't know, or there's a possibility that you could make a mistake, just like anything in life. You make mistakes, you try and learn from your mistakes, and if you continue to persevere and acknowledge that you're not perfect, then I think you'll come the closest to achieving perfection in that way.
That was a great
I
answer.
can add something about that. I think the most important thing if you work in a lab is, number one, integrity. If you're a honest person, whatever your knowledge, if you have a limited knowledge, but you know the difference between what you know and what you don't know, you can be a very good lab gemologist. It's not about the knowledge or the instrument. It's, number one, about the integrity. You have some so-called lab gemologists who don't have integrity, and they are helping people to cheat other people. I don't call them gemologists. They are just crooks like the other one.
Yeah.
So the number one thing is integrity, and then it's reputation. So there are some labs, like some of my friends in Myanmar, they are not world famous because they are in a producing country, but they are honest people, they are hardworking people, they are very knowledgeable, as you say, about the stone from basically their country.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't have seen, for example, all the new treatment and all these things coming from other place.
Yeah.
So everybody has his, level of expertise. But as long as you are able to you do your work with honesty, I think you can be a good gemologist, whatever your level of knowledge. But the day you lose that and you start not being a honest person anymore, so I think you should go to another business.
Yeah.
So it's all the way about how you handle your mistakes. When you make a mistake, how you handle the mistake. When you're a lab gemologist, that's the big question.
Yeah.
And I think that's this is one of the things with your grandfather. He was able to be a very respected lab gemologist, a respected gemologist, and also a trader. And the only reason why he was able to do that, I think, is because of his integrity.
Mm-hmm.
The number one thing, his integrity.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think that's a great summation of everything that we've just said over the last 3 hours. So, Edward, I want to thank you so much. I think this is maybe the longest or the second longest one we've ever done. The story. I mean, I feel like we could just keep going. I have questions I didn't ask,
I
so
don't think
maybe
so.
we'll
I
have to
think
do
we
a
were
part
just
two.
no. I think we are not just yet 3 hours.
Well, almost.
Yeah, but I think we went one time at 3 hours.
Okay.
Do you want to round it up to
It's a
3?
good one.
That was a good one. Yeah, with lots of good stories. Maybe we have to get you back for a part two sometime.
Sure.
We can spin the topic in some other way. So we'll start. But yeah, great stories, and I thought this one was especially cool because yeah, as you said, we did already talk to we had the webinar about the photo atlas and
On
talking.
Puebla?
Yeah, talking to Cuevela. So I feel like we got the closest that we could do to getting the other side of the story about about this experience, and what kind of stories would we have gotten if we could have interviewed your grandfather. But we got to interview you, which is great. So thank you for
If
your
you,
time.
I think if someone has, the photo atlases are factual. The internal world of gemstones would give you probably the clearest insight into my grandfather's mind and what he felt about gems and gemology. And because there's so many incredible poetic references that he just was in love with gems and in love with the inclusions that they shared with him. He even developed a microscope that had arms to it, and I thought it was for stability, but he explained to me that sometimes he was looking at the stone for so long his arms would get tired, so he made these arm rests that he could put his arms on while he was looking at the stone.
Just to relax. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I know some people, they put around the eyepiece of the microscope something in order to be able to sleep more conveniently. To put
Yeah, George
but
Boehm
I
taught
never
me
heard
that
about the head one. That's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
When we
George.
worked in the lab, you'll remember, Vincent, at the Googlen lab, the air conditioning, it was not great. And during the summer, we just open, typical Swiss, they just open the windows. And boy, in the afternoon after lunch, you come back and you're working at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you're fading. And George Bossart one time secretly showed me how he would take a little power nap at his microscope while he looked like he was working. So yeah, it was great.
I'm pretty sure I did that at least one time when I was in GIA. Diamond grading after lunch. This is hard.
That's bad.
No, I'm not saying like a 5-minute nap. You put your eyes on the thing. No, the lights are low. You're full of Thai food. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
I
Well,
never did that. I never.
I'm taking credit. I'm a gem cutter, so it's okay. I don't have to be the best gemologist.
No, I did that. I did that.
Oh, you did.
I fell asleep also in front of a microscope one time, or maybe more than one time. That's true.
Yeah, it
I think
happens.
we both did that.
And so Edward, if people want to find you and find some of your publications, they're up on your website, right? Raresource.com.
Yep. Yes, go to raresource.com and then look under publications.
And you have gemstones on there too, I think, right?
I have gems and minerals and photos from different places I've been. It's not regularly updated, but but there's definitely lots of fun things to see on there.
Cool. And you're also exhibiting at shows. So if people want to find you in Tucson, I think I've seen you in Tucson a couple times, but
Yeah.
you're usually in Tucson and other shows around the world, so people can find you in real life as well.
The first next show that we'll be doing is in Las Vegas, the AGTA show at the Encore, which takes place the same time as the Couture show, which is just a few days before the big main show.
Okay, cool.
That'll be the next one. Mm-hmm.
Cool.
When would that be?
That's the end of August.
Also, there will be show in Las Vegas end of August.
Yeah, the Vegas show, which typically takes place the beginning of June, it has been moved to the end of August.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So the JCK, what was the JCK Las Vegas show is now going to be the end of August, and AGTA has combined with the Couture group, and their show is prior to the main big show.
Okay.
So it's getting bigger. It's a little mini Tucson coming there.
Mm-hmm.
2 shows in a row. Cool. Okay, so maybe I won't see you there, but maybe I'll see you in Tucson. Someone maybe will see you there that's here. And yeah, so thanks again, Vincent. I'll see you in a month. Do we know who we're talking to?
Yeah, we know. We are going to speak with. We are going to have the great privilege to welcome one of the most, or probably the most famous French gemologist at the moment, Professor Emmanuel Fritsch. With
wow.
we are going to speak about basically the articles that he wrote a long time ago when he was working at GIA. He was a research gemologist at GIA, and he wrote an article about the origin of color in gemstones. That was one of the first articles I read about the subject, and then I went to the thing. But it's a very good. Actually, there were 3 articles in Gems Gemology, and that I really enjoy a lot. And actually, I met Emmanuel Fritsch the first time during the same trip with Henry Ho. I went to Switzerland to meet your grandfather, to meet Dr. Gublin. So I met at few days Emmanuel Fritsch and then Edward Gublin. It was a very memorable trip. And since then, I'm very good friend with Emmanuel. And
Cool.
Emmanuel is so knowledgeable and just such a fun guy. He's going to be so entertaining. He's actually one of in my article I wrote about, there were a number of gemologists that I wanted to test their site ID capabilities on a yellow tanzanite. And along with George Rossman, Emmanuel Fritsch, and I think maybe Fred Poe, they were the ones that were able to site ID that gem. And, Hodgkinson was another one. So he has amazing talent with gemology, mineralogy. Just a great guy. That's gonna be so fun.
No surprise at all, because it's not a very well-known thing, but every year in France there is, in a small village in Morvan called Poil, an event called Gemmology à Poil, which in French means gemology naked, because à poil means naked in French. Mm-hmm. So you have this event, which is not exactly, is very like low-key and easygoing, not something very formal. All formality are out. Go there in this tiny village, because Emmanuel Fritsch, Jean-Pierre Chalin, and Franck Notary, and also Garcia are all from the same area in the Jura. So they created this event that is taking place every year around beginning July. And about that, I think beginning July, yes. And there is all the time a competition with 20 or 30 stone that people have to identify without just like that, and find out what it is and be able to explain why they get the answer.
It's like the Gemmology Olympics.
And Emmanuel is, I was able to see that several times. Emmanuel is super good. There are 2 or 3 guys there. They are so good. They are really so good.
Yeah.
No surprise that he was able. I was kind of okay, but these guys are. There's another guy, Denis Gravier. He's a killer. He's this kind of thing. He's a gem merchant on the gemologist. He's super good with this kind of thing. I cannot believe. Yeah,
Cool. And
no surprise.
so that's exactly 3 hours. See you guys. Thanks for
All
the
right.
time. Thanks for everyone for sticking around for an extra hour. We
Yeah.
didn't plan that, it just happened. So great stories. Couldn't stop. So why not? Okay. We'll see you guys later. Be safe.